We can approve, item 1 is the approval of the agenda for November 9th. We have 2 to approve, so we couldn't do that last time, but we should have a quorum of folks that were here. Any comments or issues on the November 9th minutes?
Move to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Second?
Seconded by Kate. Anybody in favor? Aye?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay.
Just for clarification, because she's unable to be physically present, Mary Ann is going to be doing the minutes from the tape. So the motion was for the approval of the agenda. I'd heard the references to the minutes. I just want to make sure that everything is really clear. Dick, you were approving the agenda?
Move for approval of the agenda.
Okay,
Okay.
okay,
And that's today's agenda or?
Today's agenda.
Okay.
okay.
Item 2.
All right, moving on to the approval of minutes for November 9th. Any comments, feedback? Suze, you weren't here.
Look good to me.
Yeah, I did have one thing. On page 2, third paragraph, said that I noted a restaurant is not allowed use in the rural district. And that was not the intent of my statement. I was saying that there was or has been a restaurant there for 30 to 40 years. So it wasn't.
So can you cite the specific paragraph?
Well, the first sentence says Dick Elkins noted a restaurant is not allowed use in the rural district. And I don't know, I thought maybe you might have said that, but I said that.
I
don't know who said it.
Question Mary Ann, she goes back to check her notes are right, so.
Well, what I said,
there's a
what
desire
I
to go
said
back.
was there's been a restaurant there for 30 or 40 years.
I don't know that, if this is in connection with Quiniesca?
Correct.
Yeah,
Right.
I don't know that is what you said, Dick, because I think if you had said that, I would have contested it, because there has not been a restaurant. At least there hasn't been anything approved as a restaurant. There may have been some kind of
Possibly
food
not, but-
service.
But I know I've eaten there for a long, long time.
Well, then maybe what you want to do is have Mary Ann research it and check her notes, because if it was,
Okay, well, that was my intent.
well, you can't, the minutes aren't what your intent is, Dick. The
I
minutes are what you
understand
said.
that, but I'm pretty sure that that was the direction I went, but, okay.
Well,
Regardless, we know the restaurant is not allowed in a rural district. I'm just stating that I've been eating there for a long time.
it may be, so if we want to, if the body wants to adopt the minutes, you could edit it so that it says, a restaurant is not allowed, an allowed use in the rural district, period. Take Dick off it, because he doesn't want to be associated with it, but it was noted that a restaurant is not an allowed use in the rural district. If you want the record to show tonight that you've eaten at the food service at Quiniesca Golf Course 40 years ago, then we'll make sure, Mary Ann, when you do the minutes, note that.
Okay. We can change it to just it
Well,
was
I'm
noted.
fine with just taking my name off there.
Yeah. Change it to it was noted. Does that work? Instead of, Yeah.
Your minutes.
okay, yeah.
That was it for me.
So we have move
So-
to approve November 9th.
So moved.
Second?
Everybody in favor? Aye.
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 Can we do January 11th if we only have myself, Susanna, and Perry of the 4 that were here? Or do we need to?
If neither one of them, of the folks who were missing, watch the tape and are prepared to vote in favor, let's just table it until next
Okay.
time, or hold it until next time.
Okay. All right, moving on to disclosures related to any potential conflicts of interests.
I have none.
I have none. Perry?
None.
Okay. Moving to item 5, open to the public. No. All right, item 6, the Quiniasco request.
If I may, maybe I can introduce
Yeah.
the general topic
Sure.
of the zoning changes. There was included in your packet a memo that introduced the 3 topics that you'll be talking about that are zoning related tonight. And the Quiniasca request is the first one. As noted in the memo, located in a 90-acre parcel in the rural zoning district. The dimensional requirements in that district have caused the clubhouse structure that's located along Spear Street to be non-complying. And folks came to the commission, I believe, on November 9th, and that was the one time, and brought to your attention their desire for a zoning change. The property owner's engineer, David Marshall, who spoke, suggested some text. I've included that text in your packet. I've also included a slightly revised version for your consideration, and the intention was to have it be the foundation for a discussion generally applicable. So to this and to the other, there was, at the end of the memo, just the steps of the amendment process for any folks who are relatively new to know what is involved if you agree on a proposal to amend the regulations. You come to terms with the text. You would direct me as staff to have it on your next agenda along with a proposed bylaw change report. And then at that next meeting, or whenever you set it for, but let's assume it's the next meeting, you could then approve the report and approve the warning of a public hearing, and it would go off from there. You'd hold the hearing. If it was okay, you pass it on to the select board. If they hold their hearing and they like it, it gets adopted.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, as I remember when we talked about it on the 9th, is your first name again? I'm sorry. Dave Marshall. Yeah, Dave Marshall had come up with this pretty creative solution of a structure existing as of 1965. And I do like, I guess, personally, the way Dean has generalized it so that it's less specific to one situation. And, you know, that was the sort of only heartache I think we had the first go around, was that it was clear we were just fixing something for a particular issue versus saying what would be some general verbiage that would fix it for all cases.
And because Mary Ann is doing the minutes from the tape, if you do speak, yes, please use the mic. And I was just going to pull up for the viewers at home the site plan so that they could see the image that we're talking about, as well as the text.
So while Dean's working on that, for the record, Dave Marshall from Civil Engineering Associates. Our original intent was to minimize the number of properties that perhaps would benefit from this, not purposely, but to, you know, on the backside, try to limit Pandora's box, which is
Right.
obviously a concern anytime we're changing regulations in regards to what could happen. I think what Dean has done is basically simplify things, and from an administrative side of things, as far as applying the proposed rule, it certainly is a much better tool to achieve both what the golf course would like to see happen, to enable the porch to be installed on the backside of the building, but at the same time, it would probably afford other people the opportunities that right now they can't have. So we were I didn't get a chance to thank Dean for his work on that, but it looked very good to us in regards to still a tool to achieve the goal.
And just to reiterate again, this is the location, Spear Street. The structure, this is in the rural zoning district. The setback extends to a point that is approximately here, so the entire building is located within the setback.
And what you see on the far right-hand side of the structure is the proposed porch. So you could get a flavor of its location in relationship to the rest of the structure.
Yeah, I think I'll just throw out there for Susanna's benefit, when we talked about this in the 9th, was the idea that obviously a successful business, that everybody's excited to see new ownership, keeping it a golf course and using. And so our task was to try and figure out a way to say, let's move forward and kind of make this work, but without, as Dave said, opening Pandora's box to all kinds of changes. You know, so the general consensus, I think, on this board 2 months ago was, yeah, we should figure out a way to make this work.
Only thing I would say or ask now is that you could do each of these requests in turn. You could save them all up towards at least the first two. Anyway, it's your choice. But if the intention of the body is to move this forward, then a motion directing me to have it on your next agenda along with a draft bylaw change report would be in order.
Okay.
So if somebody wanted to move that and second it and you approved it, then.
Okay.
I'd like to ask exactly what we're, I apologize for not getting the document, to the document. But is this what we're talking about, or is this,
Yeah,
So in section, the
if you
proposal
keep rolling.
is the, it's affecting section 920 nonconformities.
So keep turning here.
I can do two things. I could just
So
abstain.
this was the proposed one that they threw out, and then Dean's is another page or two further, which is just a kind of edit of that, taking out the in commercial use since 1965, basically. The only question I had with that was in the rural district and existing structure in commercial use, or is that implied that if it's there, it's existing?
Doesn't this, is number two the whole change?
The proposal would amount to a single paragraph. So Dick, if you want to go to the page that looks like this, a couple of pages up in front of that. So you're going to change, whoops. Sorry, take that back. Right, in the rural district. So this is affecting nonconformities. It's going to go in a section that is where the Development Review Board gets to.
So B,
It's going to be 1920B2.
B2. Okay, so B2 that is
And-
underlined now
And
is the
no, there's no
proposal.
B2 right now.
Okay.
So it's all new. It's all new. So it would say that in the rural district, a structure that's non-conforming by virtue of extending into the setback from a highway may be extended or expanded if it doesn't get any closer. That's the same.
So I guess my question is, there is no restriction on this as long as it's not closer
Right,
to the road.
like it is in
Shouldn't there
the,
be-
like it is on Long Route 7. The same
Shouldn't there
allowance.
be a restriction of some sort? I mean, we're just leaving it open-ended to,
Well, that's what I think David was doing, was mimicking what is allowed along Route 7. So if you look at paragraph 1,
I don't know if we want to treat it like we treat Route 7. It's a different
okay, well,
district entirely.
the commission can certainly consider that, and that's the heavy lifting that the commission gets to do. The proposal to start the discussion was to treat a structure that's not conforming in the rural district the same way that a structure in the mixed-use district, the Commerce and Industry, and the Commerce and Industry South districts get treated. Those three districts all have that, I'll call it a luxury, where the only constraint is the maximum point of encroachment. You get to build along that line of encroachment. I mean, I know that in other places, in other towns, there's a limit put on it, but in those other districts in Shelburne, if you have a 50-foot setback and the building is 30 feet, then the setback in that case effectively becomes 30 feet. But you're saying, maybe put some limits on it, and that's
I think it calls for some kind of limitation. I favor what you're trying to do, but not to the degree that this leaves it too open.
So limit,
You could put a structure in there, the way this is written, you could, with a huge piece of land like that, you could put a huge structure in there.
But it has to be a case where there's already a building there. There has to be, it all hinges on a non-conforming structure. It's not changing the default setback in the district. It's only saying that if you have a structure that encroaches, it can wiggle a little bit. It can grow a little bit as long as it doesn't get closer to that front yard encroachment.
Dean, can we ask you to put the plan back up on the screen, and perhaps visually that'll assist us kind of understand perhaps options on how to further restrict this particular type of request? So what Pandora's box says here is that if the, oh, thanks. If the, as Dean indicates, the front yard becomes the, or the front of the building becomes the de facto front yard setback, then what could happen is that building additions could be put both, north is up on this particular plan, both on the north side and south side, flush with the current facade. I don't know if that's desirable. I think that's what I'm hearing Dick say is, gee, we could basically have a building that's 300 feet long, that's, you know, X number of feet off the face of the off the rights of way. So, I mean, another thing you could do is indicate that the addition can only occur in the back half of the building. You know, I haven't vetted that particular one, but all of a sudden, at least what you would see as far as additions on the building would be initially set back by half the depth of the building from the existing rights of way. So that's another way of thinking about it. You know, we're just trying to figure out how to put what we think is kind of an innocent porch on the back of the building, with the understanding that there was obviously some goals with creating a 100-foot setback along the rights of way within the rural district. So going back and understanding what those goals were, and then trying to figure out how we can still achieve those goals with this particular type of amendment is important. Other things that we could do, that you could do, is, for example, that the addition could not extend out further, in this particular case, the north-south direction than the building. So you don't get that particular effect of north-south linear expansion closer to the rights of way than what perhaps the original intent of the setback for the rural district is set at.
And that's definitely an approach that could be used. I'm wondering, Dick, would your concern be addressed also, or alternatively, by language that says something like, except that in no case shall the building footprint of the expansion exceed some certain number of square feet or some percentage of the original?
I'd like to limit it to the rear of the building and to not be increased by, say, 20%.
But I guess the question
Other
would,
examples, right?
well, I was just saying the question, I mean, in this particular case, the rear of the building is the place you want the deck, but if the optimal place to put that deck was on the north or the south side of the building, we'd be talking about a slightly
Something
different thing.
wouldn't we? Yeah.
You know, so I guess that's where I was looking at percentage of the existing structure. And you wouldn't limit it on north, south, east, west.
You would, like, you were going back to the Lakeshore District, you would, there's no expansion closer to,
Right, well, I mean, in this
You
case,
would
you
not
could, you could
increase-
expand, in this particular case, north, south, and I guess
Yeah,
east, but not west, because you couldn't get closer. That's already built into the rules. But, you know, I mean, in this particular case, we're saying
I would not want to extend the frontage, the
right.
width of the building. We're talking about a whole district that we're making a rule for, a little rule for this structure. So we have to be aware of the possibilities of what occurs in the rest of that district. And I don't think that we would be out of line to restrict it to the rear of the building and to restrict it to a certain percentage of the building.
I guess my question would be, do you get the biggest bang for your buck with just a percentage? Where if the most logical use or obvious place to do that was, and again, I'm just playing devil's advocate and asking the question. I don't know. You know,
Well, I think that what we're trying to do is to answer a request that I think was reasonable.
correct.
But not to make a change that is, the next person may not be quite so reasonable.
Right.
So picking up on Dick's thoughts, reading between the lines, you know, one thing that putting it on the backside of the building does is that if the intent of the 100-foot setback in the rural district from the rights of way was to create a corridor of openness, you know, structures set back from the roadway, not right on top of it, then restricting construction to the backside is not going to make the existing condition any worse. I understand what you're getting at in the fact that there may be structures that would benefit better because of their interior floor layout to do something on either side. I'm just conservatively responding to and reading between the lines, because I wasn't here when the planning commission wrote the rules for the rural district as far as what the concepts were, what the goals were. But we're having worked in other communities and understanding, again, when we have larger setbacks, and especially in the rural areas, it's because we enjoy the openness of those particular areas when we drive along them. We may be commuting from one place to the other, but we still enjoy the openness of the area. In order to basically preserve that, the concept that would achieve perhaps the safest goal without opening up too much of the box would be kind of what Dick is talking about right now. I'm not in a position to talk about percentage right now, just because we hadn't run any numbers on that particular end. We can do one visually, which kind of looks at that and says, well, 20% looks like it would work for Quiniesca. But I really couldn't speak for any other clients as far as whether a small house, that has a small footprint but might benefit from, a nice open air porch might need more than 20%, 25, 30, 40. I don't know that answer. I don't mean to muddy the water. I just want to make sure that you've also had the opportunity to think about that number a little bit too.
Right.
And I will get kind of planner geek on you, to say at the rear of the building, in concept is easy, but you'll have to be more specific.
Yes.
What does that mean? Could the addition be essentially at one point on a corner and it goes off essentially diagonally? Is that, how much time do you want to spend on that? What I can offer is that there's a concept that's often used in zoning regulations called you have building front lines, you have building rear lines. We could refer to the building rear line, and as long as the addition is not closer to the road than the building rear line, then that would cover it. We don't have the definition of building rear line in our regs right now, as far as I know. It could be added, but anyway, I just wanted you to have that information, that to simply say to the rear of the building, we're probably going to get some, someday someone's going to say, well, is that to the rear? Does that qualify?
And the only other thing I can add, Dean's 100% right. The only other layperson way to describe the goal that we're talking about right here is on the side of the building opposite of the highway or roadway rights of way. Again, it goes back to definitions and making sure that you've pinned that down.
Closer to the highway than existing.
That's written in there though, really, right? Right.
Yeah, we've got that. Yeah, that's the way it's written right now, is that any addition can't be any closer than the facade of the existing structure.
Right.
And that's the concern that I've heard Dick kind of discuss was.
Yeah. And I appreciate the simplicity, the appeal of the simplicity, but I'll play devil's advocate too, and that is to say, if you are looking at this plan, and in addition to the proposal to just do it to the rear, do you really have a justification for excluding something here if there was good reason to have it wrap around?
Well, if we're limiting it by percentage, then I don't really care if they wrap it around.
Okay, and that goes to this question of, well, to the rear, is that to the rear?
Right. Or do you say it's behind the facade of the building? So it just, yep.
Not to extend beyond the sides would be, I guess, you must have a term for that.
Yeah, that seems very simplistic language that would achieve the intent of
And a
not
certain
having it become
percentage.
broader.
Right. What would be the planner geek term for the sides? The sides, perpendicular to the road.
Yeah, I mean, that would probably be what we would say, or
Yeah.
I would say. So I'm just wondering whether or not, does the commission feel inclined to hammer out language when we can? Do you want to see something before you're ready to say, let's go to hearing on that? Where's your basic stance? Because I'm trying to get a handle on that.
Well, can you hammer out some language and get it to us and let us say, yeah, it looks good and have it
No,
ready for next?
because you have to do it at a meet, I mean, you could, no, the thing to understand is the public needs to know what it is you're holding your hearing on. You can always change it at the hearing. I mean, sometimes the commission has felt like, it's not 100%, and this is not a discussion in lieu of the hearing. It's to have something that you feel is good enough to discuss at public
Right.
hearing. I'm not saying stop working on it, but I'm just saying it's not the end. It's basically to get this discussion, this topic in play and rolling.
Is 2 weeks a long time for you?
So, Dean, if you were to put your scheduler hat on with the understanding that you get to control the select board, what would be the best schedule that we could likely see with regard to the opportunity for the applicant to then apply for a zoning permit?
I haven't mapped it all out, David.
I know. It was an
So,
unfair
I mean,
question, but I thought I'd put you on the spot.
If the group had, well, the next meeting of the commission after tonight is the 8th. If the group if it met on the 8th and said, yep, we're going to warn a hearing, then the hearing would be at the first meeting in March. So that puts it on March 8th. And then passing it on to this, if the hearing is held and it's passed along, the earliest opportunity that the select board could hear it would be the 13th. That's going to be the organization meeting of the select board. They might simply accept and warn a public hearing, and then that would put it at the 10th of April, conceivably, when they would hold their hearing and adopt it. And if they adopted it then 21 days after that, it would go into effect.
Much time for. So just for clarification, we're trying to determine it's not so much an issue with this structure, it's what other pre-existing structures in rural districts are going to, what are we setting a precedent for, right? And so there may be structures where a side extension works better for that siting, whereas this one works better in the back. So restricting one direction or another it's probably not wise.
Well, some,
Conflicted. I sort of feel
there
like
aren't,
it could be
there
wise.
probably aren't that many structures that are going to be
Well, I'm kind
affected
of
by
trying to
this.
think in my head, okay,
There are
driving
very
along,
few,
and what are
in
the
fact.
structures that we're talking about? I mean, that's what I'm
It's
curious.
generally speaking going to be these situations where you have a house that's on a small pre-existing lot.
Right.
That, so if you can think of the intersection of Dorset and Barstow and Cheese Factory, you have a little cluster building.
Yeah.
One was a former school. I mean,
Yeah.
those are structures on small lots that may not meet the front yard setback. Although it's a smaller setback requirement for small lots, that's the other thing. So there may not be a lot of cases.
We're not
Right.
taking
Isn't there
anything
a
away
further
from
restriction
anybody,
that
we're
applies only
actually
to
giving
commercial
Right, right.
projects and commercial use?
No, the setback is.
And that's
setback
how
isn't
David had
differentiated.
written it, but
Oh, okay. Oh, we've,
yeah, and then Dean had tried to,
Well,
So this is a gift. This is not, we're not taking away anything from any property. If whatever we give here is a gift.
correct.
I should put it that way, but it's a change.
So one other thing, which is kind of a hybrid of the thoughts, which is we've talked about an addition on the backside of the building, however we want to define that. The other thing, as far as using percentages, is perhaps to allow not on the backside, but on the sides, up to a certain percentage of the footprint. So what that does is keeps the building from becoming an elongated feature, but does allow for some flexibility in regards to use of the property. So that's another idea as far as how we could skin a couple of cats that way.
I'm getting the sense people are mostly concerned about is not introducing something where you might have a future condition where the scale is just completely out of character.
Right.
So if that's our concern, as you say, there are a couple different ways to skin that cat. And one might be, as you were suggesting, or to, limit it to a certain percentage or something like that, but not be so picky about where this
Where it goes.
actually gets located, because Susanna's right, different site conditions will dictate different needs. And I think, one of the things that this will incentivize is reuse of some existing structures, which I think is something we want to encourage as a rule, rather than making it so difficult to reuse a structure adapt it for a new purpose, that then somebody's incentivized to go out to a green field, particularly if they
Or
want to be
demo
or
Yeah.
demo it, particularly if they want to be in the rural area in the first place. So, so I think I'm personally in favor of something that would allow flexibility while putting a limit on the ultimate potential scale of a new structure, but allow a lot of flexibility within that.
Okay. So that would bring us back perhaps to the percentage approach, where we're trying to control how large the expansion occurs, perhaps along the face of the roadway or parallel to the roadway. So anyways, that would be the next discussion point in regards to, what number do we think we're comfortable with?
Dean, any particular reason why you see it better to strike out the commercial use?
Just because I'm generally opposed to writing bylaws in a way
One-offs.
that are,
Yeah.
it's colorful. People, when they write the history of zoning in Shelburne in, 2190, they'll think about there's got to be a reason for this. But I'm not sure that you don't seize the opportunity to address this issue for more than this property. You don't want to be back here 6 months from
I guess
now.
what I'm asking is, if we're worried about houses potentially
Oh,
in the rural
in
district,
a
if you
commercial structure, then I would ask, why only give the allowance for commercial,
right,
not for residential?
again, I'm just asking, but trying to figure out
So,
is there,
my
how do
my
we,
thinking was
yeah.
is that I wasn't. The pool is small, and I wasn't seeing. Even if you made a mistake, you're not going to have significant impacts because of the size. But furthermore, I don't think it's really a mistake if you're adapting the policy that you have in place in 3 other districts and using it here to allow someone
Right.
to do what you've said you would like them to be able to do.
Right.
I didn't think about limiting the size because there is no such size restriction in those other 3 districts. Although when Dick brings up the Lakeshore, he's right. There is a lot more involved with the expansion of structures in the Lakeshore district. On the other hand, the Lakeshore district is unique because of what that overlay district is trying to do.
So if we kind of agree with the general text that's more generalized, what we'd be missing would be some limiting factor, ideally a percentage. So is that all we'd really be needing to decide now, would be what that
To my way of
fair
thinking,
number is?
yeah, to my
Okay.
way of thinking, that if you could reach consensus, that you would have some phrase at the end that said, except that in no case shall the building footprint of the expansion exceed X% of the existing building footprint. If you could figure out what the number is for the sake of warning the hearing between now and the hearing and at the hearing, if you used 20 to start and you think the number should be 25, or if you used 20 to start and you think in the end it should be 15, you can change them.
I'm going to throw out 60%.
Okay, I mean, just whatever the number.
So just to be a stick in the mud, public policy in Shelburne, when you go to the sewer ordinance, those buildings or uses that are located out of the current sewer service district, but currently are served by the town, they cannot expand their use by more than 50%. So there's a public policy number in town that would represent, I'm sorry?
Is Quiniesca on the sewer?
It is.
It is, okay.
And it is subject to that same limitation as far as what it historically has, as far as the design flow and where it could go in the future.
Yeah, because I was thinking something along the lines of like 33% or 50%, it's
I'm still thinking 20%.
a third
I'm
more.
looking at this edition as being maybe 12, 15. I'm just guessing.
Dean, can I operate this?
Yellow button.
Which one?
Yellow button.
Yellow.
You're looking for the, oh no, you're trying to advance it?
Oh, I just want to go back to the site
Thinking
plan.
about answering questions.
Okay, well,
I'm thinking about redesigning the whole area. So. Guess you
I,
guys
I
are
wasn't
really
working on my
close.
telemetry very well. There we go.
What do you mean?
So Dick's point is that when you look at the proposed addition and just see how many times it will fit within the existing footprint of the building, if you could imagine 1, 2, 3, maybe 6 of those. So you're at 16% approximately. So the 20% number would appear to work for this particular proposal. So we would be very fortunate and very happy with that particular number. Whether somebody else would say, geez,
Yeah, I was just trying to think of like, looking at that picture, say at what scale would a huge deck off the back
Exactly.
be absurd?
Yes.
And I think 50% is about the max.
But
where
this
it-
doesn't limit it to deck. This doesn't limit
Right.
structure. It could be any kind of structure.
Sure.
That's my
Right.
concern.
But if you took that building, sliced it in half this way, added another half behind it, it doesn't really, it doesn't really change the character. That's why I sort of netted out as 50.
It changes in that it changes traffic flow, it changes use, it changes a lot of things.
Well, so Dick, there are separate and related questions, though, that would have to do with this proposal that go beyond being able to build any building within the setback. So this is dealing with nonconformity, but if it's a conditional use and they're expanding that conditional use, then those issues will get addressed through the conditional use review process.
Right. But the guidance starts with us. And I guess what I was starting to say
Yeah.
before was, we were asked to deal with a question here, or to help deal with this situation. And what we're talking about doing now is something that we should be taking our time on. If we want to make that
Right.
major change, then let's do that in another time. But let's just deal with this
Okay.
effectively and get it done. And when we do work on other zoning issues in the rural district, which I guess is coming up, we can,
So what would be your proposal then to go
I would
forward with this with a
propose-
small percentage, and then we could look at that number later and effectively adjust it
and it
higher?
may prove out that, I don't see a lot of structures out there that really are going to come into play here anyway. I don't think there are that many, if any. So I would propose, I'd stick with my proposal, the 20% increase, and not to extend further. I don't know how you place the side thing. Those are the only two issues I have. And I don't care if it's 20 or 25. It's just, I think it's a reasonable approach.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't,
I feel like the backside thing might be artificially constraining it and then ask for more language. So I guess I would lean towards just using a percentage to constrain it. And my preference would be something a little bit higher than 25, probably more like, a third, but yeah. Perry, you're right around the corner. What do you think?
I missed the last piece. Are you talking about my broad views or just
Well,
the last comment that was made?
in this particular case, if we were looking at, saying, okay, we're okay with expanding these structures, but limiting that expansion by a percentage, Dick was leaning towards limiting it to something more like 20, maybe 25%. Some of us said higher. There are other constraints that would probably cap the max at 50. So like what would be the number we'd be willing to go to warn a public meeting on to say we think this percent increase is the right amount?
Well, my understanding when we first discussed this was that this was a very unique piece of property within Shelburne, that it's a golf course, that it's a 1965 structure. So what is the number that gets the nappies to where they can build the deck that they want? Is that 20%? Is that 22%? Obviously, the lowest number possible where they get the deck that they want, that you can't see at the front of the structure, doesn't extend beyond the sides of the structure, so that kind of everybody's happy. It's the minimum amount, and they get the deck that they want. What percentage is that?
Okay.
And it's stating the obvious, but I will do it anyway. People need to just be reminded that you're setting in motion, we'll wait to see what happens, but setting in motion the change to the regs, which the nappies would then apply for approval under, And the DRB could have its whole discussion, and it would any future applicant about the impacts associated with that proposal. So it's not the end of the line. You, as a commission, agreeing to change the regulations, and if the select board goes along, are not determining the fate. They still have to convince the members of the DRB.
Right. Okay.
Which is why I favor a higher number, to give an applicant more flexibility, because, and I say that for the reason that I think it's really important that we incentivize reuse of existing buildings. If we are against sprawl, particularly in the rural areas, we have to make it feasible for people to be able to reuse existing structures, particularly if they're non-conforming. So I am in favor of more flexibility. I don't know what that number is, but maybe it's something closer to what Andrew was suggesting, which is the 33.5 or something like that %. It looks like we have an upward limitation of 50% maximum anyway. So, so somewhere in there seems to make sense to me.
Suze, you got any
I
preference?
agree, assuming that then the DRB
Right. Well,
kind of gets to say like, no,
Yeah.
you can't throw a aluminum sided whatever on the side of that beautiful brick.
The DRB allows what
Right.
is put in front of it. We are the ones that
Right.
determine what the DRB does. So if we put 50%, they will allow 50%.
Right.
They're not going to set you back. They almost never do.
No,
Even stylistically.
to come to Dick's side, the DRB is going to apply the rule. They do have secondary issues, which Dean is pointing out, that
Right.
if a building addition or any expansion creates secondary issues, that they do need to be addressed satisfactorily. But your point is well taken, that if the rules say you can have 50%, somebody could come in with 50% in some point in the future.
So I guess,
And I see what Kay is saying is sprawl. I think expanding in the rural district, if we're talking about Route 7, I would agree with you. But in the rural district, I disagree. I think it's two different things. I think the rural district is, it's, and this, granted, the line is right here for the rural district. But
Right.
we're putting it all the way across.
If 4 of you agree, you can reach consensus on a number for the sake of instructing me so that at your next meeting, we'll warn a hearing on it, then you can move forward. And if there aren't 4 that can agree for that purpose, then one of the things that can be done between now and your next meeting is we'll make a map that shows you structures within the setback in the rural district. So you know just how many you're talking about, if that's going to inform your decision.
no, I think it'd be crazy to hold this up over a number that I think we're relatively close on anyway. I mean, it sounds like we're trying to decide between 25 and 33%, so a quarter and a third.
Well, let's go a quarter and do it. Let's do a quarter, I'll vote for it. Otherwise, I'm gonna kind of stand my ground. I really feel strongly about this. This district is, we can play around all we want in the other areas. We're trying to develop the other areas.
Right. Well, I think,
This allows them to do what they want to do. And again, we can always address this again.
right.
Harry, do you have thoughts on a number?
I'm kind of with Dick in the fact that this is the rural district, but this is a very specific case, and so I would go for the lower of the two numbers, so I'm fine with 25%. And I understand your point on wanting to repurpose existing structures, and we're able to do that in this case.
Do we have to, what would be the next step to close this issue then?
If you want to deal with this issue, if someone wanted to direct me as your staff to have the bylaw change report and the text ready to warn for hearing at your next meeting, and the text would be as it's written, or I'll read it out loud. In the rural district, a structure that is non-conforming by virtue of the structure extending into the required front setback from a public highway may be expanded or extended if such expansion or extension does not extend any closer to the public road than the existing structure, except that in no case shall the building footprint of the expansion exceed 25% of the existing building footprint. If someone makes that motion and it's approved, then you'll have that item at your next agenda, you'll have the bylaw change report, and then you can get the warning process going.
So moved, and I won't even argue about the sideline.
Sorry?
So moved.
Okay.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Perry?
Aye.
Okay.
We'll have
Wonderful.
that ready next time.
Thank you very much for your time and your work.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to us think out loud.
Outstanding. Thank you.
Your next item is addressed in your packet, and you also have here a representative of the property owner, Chris Roy. I'm going to pull up on your screen, or on the screen, Google Earth to show the location of the property. Whoops. The location of the property that gives rise to the request.
Sherbrooke?
Oui.
And this is maybe where Dick had made earlier reference to the lakeshore setback. That's one of the things that's,
At play here, yeah.
I don't mean to reread what is in the staff report. You've got it. So maybe if you want to hear from Chris Roy.
It sounds like the issue is primarily a conflict between, whatever was set up not to impact the lake and physical safety. Is that it in a nutshell?
Well, from my perspective, yeah, we're dealing with an overlay district. Has some pretty significant limitations on what happens in that kind of magical 100 feet that starts getting measured from the 102-foot elevation contour. And the way that the Lakeshore Overlay District is written is to say basically that there are certain uses that happen or allowed to happen there. Right now, that list has things like docks and stairs and lakeshore decks, but it's an exclusive list, and the request was made for a different type of structure, a fence, went to the DRB, and their request was not approved, essentially. So the matter, discussions between the town and the property owner continued, and the basic question was, is there a way that the regulations might be modified to make it possible for an application to be filed where it could be approved? If the DRB is saying, under the current regulations right now, you couldn't approve it, if that's what, then what would need to happen in that initial staff proposal that I'm trying to get up on the screen now? Yes.
I guess I'd just love to hear a little bit more about what's driving the burning desire to build the fence.
And I think that I
Yeah,
would turn over.
yeah.
Sure, and thank you. Yeah, my name's Chris Roy, and I'm here on behalf of Jeff Halverson. He apologizes, he's out of state, not able to be here. But I'm happy to come, and I always, the last time I was here was at a Little League game out back, so even during the Little League tournament, the parking was a little easier than it was tonight. Yeah. So what had happened here is Jeff has a home that was built on the end of Shelburne Point, and Jeff has grandchildren, and if I've had the opportunity to be out to the property, as has Dean, I don't know if any of you folks have. It's a nice spot, and they've got a yard out behind the house, and then a 50-foot cliff. In generally speaking, fences are allowed within setbacks, except the way that the Lakeshore Overlay District language was written, structures aren't allowed and fences are defined as structures. And so the question became what trumps what, especially when the issue is a matter of public safety. That appeal is pending, but you know, as much being a litigator, you know, I'm speaking against my interest here, but this has always struck me as a dispute where there's a good answer out there without hammering it out in front of a judge. And it seems to me, in the language that I've seen that Dean had prepared, does that, and it really is an effort at allowing within that lakeshore setback modest, open safety fences, because as we all know, there are circumstances either because of cliffs, because of water, or other things where being next to the water, there's a very good reason for a fence of that sort. This language requires it to be 75% open. I think that makes sense. I think a height limitation of 4 feet is more than enough. It doesn't need to be a stockade fence. It's not something that's intended to block the view. And you could even put some additional aesthetic requirements on it as far as it being a subdued color or whatever else. The proposal that Mr. Halverson had presented was for a wrought iron fence and some landscaping associated with it that was aesthetically pleasing. He doesn't want to put something that's ugly out there either. So it was agreed between the town's attorney and myself that let's put aside the court litigation for the moment, see if there's something that can be done that maintains the integrity of the Lakeshore setback district, but addresses a very legitimate safety issue, and this language has come out of that. One issue that I had raised with Dean ahead of time, and I'll let him speak to it more too, there's some language defining the height, how you measure the height of the fence, and you might want to tweak that, because if there's a slope, it could be read to say you go from the lowest base of the fence to the highest high point of the fence. And if you have any kind of slope, you can see where that might create some issues. So there's some language about that measurement being vertically up and down in the same location as opposed to the entire length of the fence. Right. But other than that, my client is very supportive of the language, very appreciative of the work that town staff has done on that, and hopes that you folks will take the next step that Dean just described earlier, going forward with a bylaw report and public hearing and go through that process.
And I thought I had printed out, I know I printed out a copy of your email where you had suggested that language, and I had said I will bring it to the commission's attention at this meeting, and it's not in my folder, so if you happen to have it on you.
And I was hoping that you would have it, because I didn't bring it with me.
I'll have to run and get it, but yes, the basic situation that.
Yeah, and I think it was, from memory, I tried to jot it down. I don't know if it's going to be 100% exactly as I had put in my email, but it does the same thing. If you have the language that I had seen earlier, first there was X feet. We would suggest 4 is appropriate. And then in the last sentence, it currently reads, the height of a fence shall be measured from finished grade at the base of the fence to the top of the highest horizontal or nearly horizontal element of the fence. So you see how that language, if you had a slope, so all I was suggesting is the height of a fence shall be measured vertically from finished grade at the base of the fence to the top of the highest horizontal or nearly horizontal element of the fence directly above.
Yeah.
So it adds.
And another way of doing it is to just add the words of any given 8-foot section or something like that, because if what you're worried about is the possibility someone's going to choose this spot here for the low and this spot here for the high, you could limit it to an 8-foot section or whatever this fence would be typically installed.
Right, so, either way, I think the intention is to have a fence that the horizontal part is no more than 4 feet above grade. And however we get there language-wise is perfectly fine with Jeff, and he's happy to work with folks as far as that language goes, and however you folks see fit to do that would be great, but,
How long a section is he needing to fence off, and just out of curiosity?
I don't, yeah, and I don't, is this the pointer?
Yep.
Yellow. Okay, so around here where I'm pointing, that's
Potter.
the,
That's the Potter house.
oh,
What you the
oh, right, okay, this is before,
before
yeah,
the
this
house
is before
there.
the, okay, gotcha. So up here, the house is here. And there's been some erosion control work that's already been done there. And there's a lawn area that's here. I want to say, and don't quote me, I want to say it was like 120 feet. It was basically enough so that you could have your young granddaughter out and the area of the lawn, and it wasn't right out on, his proposal wasn't right out on the edge of the cliff either. It was in quite a bit. So it was, and I think the standard here is that it has to be for purposes of safety. And so it's not, it's not going to be something that you can then curl all the way around the house and have it be a perimeter fence all the way around. It has to be designed to create a safe condition out on the property. And so that was his intention. Now, ultimately, what he applied for before was based upon our reading of the ordinances as they exist now. He may work with staff to modify that a little bit depending upon what ultimately is passed here. But that's what he wasn't looking to do a perimeter fence. He just wanted one around the cultivated lawn area that would make it so that somebody, when it's dark, doesn't inadvertently go out too close to the cliff, or a child. As we all know, they can be quick sometimes and you don't have a chance. And I was out there. I mean, it's a drop off. I mean, you look over it. And so, yeah, you want a fence out there if you can have it. That's for sure.
Distance from the edge that he would be comfortable with, do you think? 8 feet or?
Oh,
10
I mean,
feet or-
his design was several feet back. I think thinking more broadly, because this is an ordinance change that would apply throughout the Lakeshore District. If the purpose is safety, the different scenarios under which a safety fence may be required, I don't know if they lend themselves to a set distance like that.
About twice the height of the fence or something.
And that would certainly work for our particular project. And if that's something that you folks want to consider, we would have no objection to that. That certainly
Allow
works with
some
us.
sort of growth on the,
Because one of our goals for the Lakeshore District is aesthetics from the lake, of sailors and boaters from the lake. So that's that really is one of the elements that informs the Lakeshore Overlay District. So I would think that we would want something that these fences would be only located when necessary. That would be one thing. So not a perimeter fence around the whole
Sure.
property, for example. And then secondly, there would be some kind of, as Dick was saying, some sort of a setback to allow for vegetation, so that this wouldn't be the first thing that somebody the aesthetics would be from the lake would be maintained.
Now, as it so happens, again, this is unique to this particular property, given the height of the cliff and the topography, where we had proposed the fence earlier, you literally cannot see it from the lake until you're far enough away that you're not going to be able, you wouldn't be able to see it with 100% clarity until you're so far away that you wouldn't be able to see it because it would blend in with the background. Other properties, however, are going to have more. They're going to be down either closer to shore, it's going to be more prominent. And again, my client would have no particular objection to those because given the nature of his particular proposal, and he was very mindful of this, you wouldn't be able to see it from the lake because I understand that that was one of the reasons for that restriction. And again, we agree it should be only where reasonably necessary for the purposes of safety and not for other reasons that people have for putting fences up.
A couple of other things maybe to add, Kate. This is in the Lakeshore Overlay District, so in addition to the restrictions on structures, there are also requirements related to cutting. And this allowance for this fence doesn't change anything about what the allowances for cutting are. So there's that. There's also state, again, entirely separate. And then furthermore, this is some of what makes all the discussions regarding this property complicated is the fact that it's part of a subdivision that underwent a very contentious and prolonged review and has as many documents associated with it as probably any other subdivision in Shelburne. And the conditions of approval also include the amount of cutting, and it's really, it's the result of the applicant's landscape architect, essentially, because it was their idea for the restriction of the amount and basically limitation to keyhole views. And again, none of that stuff is affected by this allowance that would say, yep, you can have a fence in addition to these other things you couldn't have before. But if you have to cut in order to put it in the fence, you're still going to have to comply with all those other requirements.
And that's my understanding as well.
And that's why I asked about the lake, because it's obviously a big stretch of cliff, but it sounds like he's putting it only in those places close to the residents where people are going to be playing, whatever.
Yeah, and the way that lot worked out, as you get out near the very tip, there's sort of one relatively flat area, which was really the only spot where you could put a house. And then the approach is from the south. It goes down to the right and to the left or east and west pretty significantly. And there is a relatively small lawn area to the north toward. So, I mean, that was basically what it was going to be. But it's all subject to the various conditions of approval with respect to the subdivision, which, as Dean pointed out, were fairly comprehensive.
I was going to say, if I'm fortunate, I can actually find a copy of the plan. If you want to see some of the materials from the DRB hearing, I wasn't expecting to show them, but if people think that could be.
That would be helpful, yeah. Because presumably that'll have some topographic
Yeah, there were
information on it, yeah.
several. Well, pressure's on. Okay, so this is the plan that was attached, to the building permit application that was denied. Let's see.
Building permit for the fence or for the house?
For the fence. Apologize that I didn't have this ready, but. So this area, whoops, where's the, yeah. So this is the plan, I believe, So, north is to our right. If I can- Okay, so north is up now. And I believe it's along here. That was the proposal that was submitted with the application. That
The
was
fence is where?
That checkered, that dash.
All the way along the there.
So north is up,
Yeah,
straight up?
this is-
Okay,
so-
all right.
So we're talking about that area. It's probably a little bit of an angle, but just giving you some context, location of the house, cleared area, fence. Does
And it
that
was-
help?
Denied because simply fences aren't on the list currently?
Not within 100 feet.
It was, I don't want to summarize because we are still in litigation, but because it didn't comply with the bylaws.
Okay.
And
But, yeah, I'll let,
the fence was treated as a structure,
Got it.
and the structures weren't allowed within the lakeshore, and it wasn't one of the listed things like docks and things that are allowed.
yeah, I mean, zoning applies to land development. You don't, if it's not land development, zoning doesn't apply. Critical element of land development involves creation of a structure. The definition of structure is not set in statute in our regulations, and in most regulations, it's very broad and typically includes things like fences. Fences and walls and many zoning jurisdictions are treated as essentially the same thing. So a fence could be many things, but a fence requires a permit, and that's what triggers the review. And then you look at these overlaying districts. This is in the rural district, but it's in this very special lakeshore overlay district that has all of these objectives and limits what you can do. The way overlay zoning works is that it modifies what's below it, and usually that modification is to make things more strict, more limited. In some cases, it broadens, but usually it's to make it more limited. And the 100-foot buffer, I'll call it, setback from the 102 contour is where the action is. It's where less is supposed to happen, which is why the things that you can do in there are specifically itemized. It wasn't itemized.
And in this case, they're not asking for perimeter, but one might argue that a perimeter is equal to safety regarding pets or very young children, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I should say that I've developed this language basically because the town is in litigation, and my boss is interested in seeing the town find a way for the litigation to be resolved, if it can be resolved through an amendment. I don't have a dog in the fight, really, in terms of whether I think that this is a great idea. It seemed to me, though, that it's possible that this could be a relatively simple fix if the planning commission felt like, in addition to those 5 or 6 other structure types, you would add to it. The notion of the safety of the fence, I've been hearing it, since this issue was raised, and to me, it's really aside from the kind of fundamentals of the zoning. The
Stairs can be
public
unsafe,
safety
right.
is usually the concern. I'm sure that this property has been studied a lot, and I'm sure that Mr. Halverson studied it a lot before he bought it. It's not so much a public safety issue as it is a private safety issue, which he would have presumably been familiar with when he bought the lot before he built the house. But irrespective of that, it is called a safety fence because that's what everyone has said that they've wanted, so that's what they say they want, so the proposal is for the safety fence.
So is the house back about 100 feet, or?
Yeah, the house meets the setback requirements, although I don't know if I've got a scale here. We can. Yes, the house meets it, but I don't know that I have the exact number. So Dick, you can see, yeah, so this was the,
That's the buildable area where your arrow is.
sorry?
Your arrow's right above the buildable area for that lot.
Yeah,
Because north is
yeah, I'm
This way?
trying to get the stupid thing to go. So yes, approval of this project included these buildable areas, and the most lakeward limit is just at that line. Yeah. So that's where it is.
So what we're looking at there, that sort of what's meant to represent a fence, is
Entirely illustrative of what the concept was, but I know that there were sort of subsequent or follow-up proposals during the hearing process. So if the regulations changed, I don't think there's anything that's restricting them, unless it's part of a settlement, to a specific fence design.
So I'm almost kind of more concerned about the location of the fence. And so what I'm wondering is would this language that you're proposing, would the proposal then be to build that fence as depicted on this plan, in this plan, or am I missing something? Would the fence be located somewhere else, or?
Well, I know that
mean, how
this
does this
is-
work with all the cutting restrictions and all that stuff that
Yeah.
has been reviewed?
I'm not,
I guess just does what was shown, sorry to be so obtuse.
No,
Does what is shown there meet all of the other requirements under the regulations for this district and for the subdivision rules themselves? Presumably it does.
it's a good question. Presumably, I don't know or cannot remember the degree to which any concerns about, not following the cutting restrictions came into play in the denial.
So the only reason for the denial, in other words, was because it was a fence and not anything else?
Right, to the best of my recollection.
So we could assume that what we're being shown here would be a depiction of how
It's illustrative, but I'm not saying it's the only
something
one.
like what we're considering approving might look like in real life
And
on
I
a
know
site.
there are and maybe Chris is prepared to address this. I know that there were iterations or alternatives. I'm pulling in this one to show it to you because it's meaningful in that it was the one that was attached to the first application, but I don't think that is required that the application made under these revised regs would look like this.
We have over time explored with the town possible other designs in an effort to see if we could reach a compromise within the existing zoning, and ultimately the decision was made by the town that given the language in the zoning, the most appropriate way to resolve this is to go to the source document, the bylaws, and actually change it. So there isn't anything about this particular proposal that is, a take it or leave it proposal. And my client, having thought about this more since the original application, may come back and, given whatever language is ultimately enacted by the town, may come back with something that's different in an effort to comply with whatever language is. But this is an example of what he had in mind, because as you can see on the left, there's a fairly significant drop off, and the thing that looks sort of like a segmented worm are actually stairs that go down there. So it doesn't continue down there. You can see sort of the flatter area that goes to the north and northeast. Where we go here? Sure. Boom. All right. So to the north of the house, and then over to the side here, and even this runs downhill a little bit. The cultivated part of the lawn is here, and then you get into some more trees and stuff here, and this particular location was selected again to avoid trees, to conform with the cutting limitations, and then ultimately to provide a fence in the area where it was needed for safety purposes. But again,
So can you run the red dot along where the fence line?
it's the dotted line, so it starts there at the top of the ridge, and then dotted line goes across
Okay.
to there.
All the way to there.
Yeah.
So is that belt-looking structure, is that the seawall?
Over to the left.
And it just goes around the point?
Yeah, these are seawall structures here.
Oh, so is that,
And then there's been some shoring up work that's been done at the base of the cliff, but I don't think that those are shown.
And so
On this-
what is that little, so the little marching ants line, right, is the fence, the dash line?
Yes,
That's the fence? And then what's the thing on the inside that sort of, is that a shrubs or something?
as I
or-
recall, that was some proposed landscaping along with that.
Okay.
Yeah, so this, I don't mean to contradict you, Chris, but
Okay,
this label goes to this line, and it says approximate length of fence, something feet, and I'm not sure that I can make out the number, but I can make out approximate length of fence tied to here,
okay. So then the dotted line is,
something else. We'll find that labeled someplace else, but the fence portion
okay.
is depicted this way.
So it's those weird little.
maybe the dotted line's the top of the.
Top of the bank, yeah, it's over here, Dick, right.
Okay, that makes more sense. Okay.
And so the fence then ends basically similar.
And again, this ultimately, the proposal could change and would certainly change to the extent necessary to accommodate whatever language is ultimately selected by the commission, you know, keeping in mind that this is language that's going to apply to lots with very different circumstances in this particular lot.
I've been on a lot of cliffs in my day where there's considerable erosion and fences start to drift down cliffs and then become really aesthetically challenging. So, I mean, I think if I were the homeowner, I too would want this fence, but I would want to set it reasonably back from the current edge to plan for future erosion.
And in fact, because erosion has been a concern with all this property, and the Halversons have done a lot of work with respect to seawalls and shoring up and are very mindful of that, their intention was to work the site so that drainage was away from the edge of the cliff going into the interior as opposed to it going out.
Interesting.
So one of the goals of the proposal as they've worked it through, and it's not necessarily, and frankly, I don't think it was as foremost in mind when this particular, and I wasn't involved with the hearings before the DRB, but since that time, he's realized there's an opportunity as well. And I think this is because he's been dealing with lots of other erosion issues, is to actually enhance the drainage on the site and make sure that you're minimizing water going over the edge and just, expediting the erosion at the top of the cliff.
When you were asking about the 2 times the height of the fence, is that what you were worried about?
I was just
or just aesthetics?
Thinking about allowing some growth on
Right.
the outside of the fence.
Right. But also erosion possibilities too.
I don't know that the fence would cause erosion, but it.
No, but
yeah,
as
it's a
erosion
buffer.
happens, if it's right on the edge, it's
Could
going to
be
go
right.
earlier.
At Shelburne Farms, it's right at the edge of the cliff.
Right.
So is there a consensus to specify a number for the distance from the top of bank as part of anything that you want?
I was just trying to understand Dick's thinking when he proposed that. Was it aesthetic or was it setback? I mean,
I was just thinking 8 or 10 feet would be a reasonable amount so you could get back there and actually take care of plantings and things, and allow for that. But that was my only thought there. That's,
Right.
And if you were to want to go in that direction, then in terms of the text that was drafted for you, you could address it the way this type of thing is addressed in other sections of the regs. If in 1720.7, lakeshore safety fence proposed to be added as a permitted use, you could follow that up with located at least X feet landward of the top of the bank. That would accomplish that.
Yeah, I think some kind of statement like that makes an awful lot of sense.
And did you guys, as a staff, have any strong feelings about
Well,
the
I mean,
X of X height of the fence?
Well, if the maximum height is 4 feet,
Right.
and if you want to use Dick's 2 times the height of the fence, I mean, those kinds of distances are a bit more relevant in my mind when you're looking at hazards from the thing. But I think as a way of expressing it or putting it into context, sure, 8 feet. I mean, it's going to be a generalized number. So if you want to go there,
No, I was just curious why you had X and didn't have
in terms
a
of the
number in mind or a suggested number.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so in terms of the basic height, I wasn't, at the time that I first drafted this, didn't feel comfortable saying, well, 4, 5, 6, whatever.
Right.
But 4 seemed to be fair. And
Isn't that
so-
the minimum height for like a pool to keep a kid out of a pool? It's 4 feet or something.
Well, and that's
Just trying to think of what's
It's a
consistent.
good point. I'm not sure that it is, because Shelburne is not one of those communities that requires a fence around pools. It's something that can be driven by homeowners insurance. So if you have a pool, then I would look in your policy and see what it specifies.
Yeah,
But
I just our
it certainly
neighborhood
sounds viable.
Our neighborhood bylaws, I think it's a minimum of
Yeah.
4 feet fence around the pool.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking of it just kind of pragmatically in terms of pets and kids and what height
Jumping.
could work.
Yeah, jumping fences. And 4 obviously fits. You suggested that number.
yeah, a 5-year-old, you can't build a fence high enough anyway.
Right. But at least it slows them down hopefully enough.
Yeah.
And they start rappelling up the thing or down or
A
whatever.
maximum of 4 feet would work. Location landward, I would be inclined to be a bit more conservative and say something like a minimum of 10 feet. For erosion, for aesthetics, just to build in a buffer. We live in some changing times, and the lake is, there's a lot going on, with the shoreline, and who knows what's in store for us. And I would think, I don't know if it's scientific, but that extra 2 feet makes me feel a little more confident that this thing might actually hold up. And allows some good vegetation to be in there. But it sounds like, at least in this particular subdivision, there was some great thought was given to, the vegetation and things like that. So, but we've got to make a decision for the whole lakeshore overlay. So I think something like 10 feet makes more sense.
And I think the description of the hazards, while it seems specific, probably most homeowners could find a hazard if they're looking for it. So one would need to be prepared to recognize that there may be fences.
Like a sand trap or something.
And, yeah, sure, depending on, so, just to be prepared for fencing to be liberally
Can you
placed.
think of a qualification that you would make? So a severe
I
hazard.
can't actually.
But
Yeah. I mean, I can't, because I was thinking, the way they've planned it out is, like I was saying, a perimeter. Some people might think in order to be fully safe, and using that word safety, then it would have to be a perimeter fence in every case, conservatively speaking. I'm just,
that troubled me in terms of the hazard piece was the open water.
Right, open water. I mean, it could be drifting down to a nice beach, and someone could call that open water, and
I don't know what you're getting at there. I mean, just think like if we're keeping away from the water, then I could put a fence
right.
anywhere.
Right, which then detracts from the aesthetics, you
Right.
know,
Right.
so, I mean, you know,
I don't know what a dangerous level of embankment is versus a non-dangerous one, but
Should it just be so many feet from the high water line, or?
Well, I would think you'd measure it some, you know, the slope would be how you would.
right.
Well, what if you have
determine
just a
that.
flat slope and you want to put a fence in, is there?
Well, that's what I think we want to avoid, is somebody having, you know, I mean, hopefully, you know, if you're buying lakeshore property, that would not be your mindset, but it could be somebody's mindset, you know, to have a perimeter fence. We can't.
And that's the
when they
thing.
have a 2-year-old running around, or someone,
That's the thinking
And
behind calling it
person-
a safety fence.
right, it's a little
That
loaded.
it's designed to keep people out of a dangerous situation, not just separate my property from yours or, you know, be an aesthetic look on my property.
Yeah, I mean, I think that does,
Yeah.
the way it is, it does accomplish that
Yeah.
distinction. As far as Susanna's comment about the open water, would it be better for it to say permanent water bodies? I mean, that makes, or the lake?
Well, I guess you wouldn't want to have a fence
On a beach.
on a beach. That's what we're trying to like, where you're close to open water where it's flat. But I mean, so,
Gotcha. Now.
I mean, I like the idea of the steepness and rock faces.
Gotcha. Now I understand. I
Yeah.
wasn't catching the point before.
I mean, you could
refer to steep slopes.
probably gonna say there's some angle of proposed steepness of slope that you could talk about, but then if it's steep and short, like,
Well-
do you have to get into, you know, steep angle and over X feet high? I mean, I just don't want to
It'll
get,
take, it'll take a lot of engineering if you have I mean, by engineering, I mean verbiage, if you're talking about a situation where you have a cliff and below it is a beach. I mean, one simple tempting solution is to have a minimum setback from a lower contour, and that way you wouldn't have a fence right near the water's edge.
right,
But then that's gonna depend a lot on terrain. But that's another way of thinking of it, is that it would have to be at least some number of feet from, say, the 98.
Above the
Or just measuring back from, planimetrically, from the 98-foot contour, you will push it away from the water's edge. Well, the 102 is the high water, so, I mean, it's, you can also use that, just potentially use a lower number. But if you're trying to get a handle at, you know, where the water is more, I mean, it's at 102 very, very, very rarely.
Occasionally.
I mean, if you think about it, you could use 102 if you're thinking about it, well, it's, you know, the beach doesn't normally get above the 102 unless someone has brought in sand.
Right, and then what we don't want is somebody to put a fence right up to the beach or something like that, you know? So,
yeah, to me, the critical phrase is the separating people from hazards, and how do we define a hazard in such a way that it is, you know, someone doesn't just fudge that, like, oh, it's, you know,
Hazard to me, right.
there's deep water right off my property, you know, but it's a
Documented,
gentle slope.
demonstrable. I mean, if it's a documented hazard, you know, what you at least put into play that it's more than pure subjectivity.
Right.
Can work on that.
Yeah, I mean, seems like we're moving in the right direction. Just
I mean, you could even call it a significant hazard or a substantial hazard.
right.
So it's not like,
Percentage of elevation, 20%, or 20, now here we are, 20% again.
Right.
But I don't know what a steep elevation would be.
well, and then what
How
about
steep it would
somebody
have
who
to
has
be
a
to be
seawall?
considered.
You know, and then they decide they want to put, you know, a big fence on top of their seawall, you know, so, it could apply
Like a
in more-
railing.
Yeah, it could apply in more,
of course, it's got to be 10 feet back. So you wouldn't be able to put it right on your seawall.
yeah.
Yeah, I think there's some modifier before hazards, life-threatening, or, you know, you're the
Yeah, I mean, that's,
attorney brand injury, you know, like what with the
When does it become a tort waiting to happen?
Well, and you know, and all kidding aside, I mean that's sort of the concern here is I don't think anybody wants to put landowners or anybody else in the position of having wanted to prevent something and not being able to prevent it and then having something happen. And,
Yeah.
ultimately that's, we don't want that to happen. And the difficulty, of course, is on one hand, you want to set out clear lines so that everybody can move forward with the same understanding. But on the other hand, everybody knows every lot along the lake is different and presents hazards we probably haven't even thought about. So you don't, in the interest of being clear, you don't want to then inadvertently allow other hazards. So, there's going to have to be a judgment call. But I think if you put in, significant hazard, as opposed to, a tripping hazard, there's, I might trip and fall, bang my head, and then I'm going to drown because I'm in 6 inches of water.
Based on the ability of the resident of that home, something may be more or less hazardous based subjectively on the
Right.
person.
So if you're moving towards something, how's this, try it for size? 1720.7 would have lakeshore safety fence located at least 10 feet landward from the top of bank. And then in terms of the definition, it would be lakeshore safety fence, an artificially constructed open barrier not more than 4 feet in height, erected within the Lakeshore Overlay District to separate people and animals from significant or life-threatening topographic hazards such as steep embankments and rock faces or rock faces. Leave out water. And then have it go on from there, and then after fence, comma, of any, or insert before the period of any 8-foot section. So that means that the
At
height.
the last part,
Yeah,
and maybe the language that we heard read
Well,
out
but
earlier.
what if there's a legitimate reason though to put? Let's say there's I'm just trying to think. There's a hill that runs parallel to the lakeshore that people go down, and otherwise it meets all of the definitions. You want to be able to have a safety fence on the slope. If you just measure it vertically from base to top at 4 feet, so at no point do you have a higher than 4 foot segment of thing, then it doesn't matter what the topography is. You're always going to have the max of 4 feet no matter where it is. Again, it's sort of the law of unintended consequences. There may be a life-threatening hazardous situation. Again, not here, but
Do we deal with this anywhere else in terms of, I'm just thinking of like fences usually can't be over a certain height in a lot of places, and how you would measure that
yeah,
height.
we don't, well,
Usually we use it for screening.
Well, I'm just thinking for that exact situation, right? So you've got a cliff, but it's, 20 feet down to the top of the cliff to the bottom here. It's 50 feet here. So it's sloping hillside, but goes down. So that 8-foot section, on an 8-foot section on a slope,
depends on right, it's gonna be,
how do we deal
basic
with
geometry. Well,
Yeah.
first thing is that our bylaw is really restrained regarding prescriptions for heights for fences.
Okay.
We do not specify heights for, limits for fences, I think in any other place or any other way. The height restriction on fence is the same height restriction on any structure. It's just not a place where Shelburne zoning regs have ventured.
I think the one thing it does say is it can't obstruct views for public highway. You can't create a hazardous.
Right, there is that one kind of qualification where if you're building a fence in a site triangle, you can't obstruct views, and so there is that, but I believe it may not be, it's a setback distance, I don't think it's a height distance, so, in terms of
So
specifying.
you could build a 20-foot fence around your
You
property
could
if you wanted
conceivably
to.
have, if you
Okay.
wanted a 20-foot fence, if your homeowners association allowed it,
Yeah, and I was just thinking, if we've solved this issue of how you define the height of a particular section of a fence, we would just try and go find that language prescribed elsewhere. But I think we're all agreeing what we want here. It's just how you phrase the
Dean, you're adding that topographic constraint language in there and removing open water, steep embankments and rock faces, goes far to limiting, eliminating the concern that somebody could just decide to put a fence up and they have like a pretty flat condition, and then we're all stuck looking at that awful looking thing,
Agreed.
which is the big concern.
Yeah, no, I think the only thing we're wrestling over is how we define the height of the, how do you limit the height of the fence to 4 feet if you're dealing with,
Well, there's an easy fix.
Yeah.
From
Just
bottom to top at any point, right?
insert the word perpendicularly. The height of the fence shall be measured perpendicularly from the finished grade to the base of the fence to the top of the highest horizontal or nearly horizontal element of the fence. So you start in the grade and you measure perpendicularly and you get to the highest point. That's going to be 4 feet. If it's
Right.
4 feet 1 inch, that's too much.
right?
And if you were counting on 4 feet by being able to measure non-perpendicularly but perpendicular to level, then make the height limit 4 feet 6 inches.
This specific fence is lakeshore safety fence.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not going to affect fences in other places.
But that's where, see, that's where I'm just sort of sketching out, I think the condition that you were talking about, where you have something higgledy-piggledy following the topography, but that's where having it be 10 foot back then allows you to have some kind of a
This is
planted
cliff.
vegetative buffer in there, so who cares? Like, you wouldn't even see it. Because,
like-
Unless there's a,
You
I mean,
measuring.
there is no mandate for the planting though.
Where the fence would go.
I mean,
Flat.
well, maybe we should add that in, that they're,
well, you'd have to
Yeah.
go
In
there.
excess of a certain percentage.
It's not there now.
okay.
It's room for planting, but there's not a requirement for
Well,
planting.
then let's add that in.
Well, the difficulty is, again, depending upon the location, it may be very rocky with very little soil. And so if you move 10 feet back from the top of bank, it may not be amenable to plantings. Or you may have other existing plantings like trees that are going to crowd out or inhibit the ability to have other plantings. So again, I think it may be possible in a lot of places, but it may be impossible or impractical in other places.
Yeah, especially if you've already been prescribed to limit your cutting, and now you're forcing a fence to an area that now requires cutting to get a fence post or a section of fence
mean-
through.
Kate, you could be going in the direction, and Kate Mitchell and I had a brief conversation internally about aesthetic elements. So maybe what you're getting at is if you wanted to address it through specific requirements about the aesthetics of the fence, it may be you'll kill the, well, I don't want to use that analogy, but maybe you can address that issue by suggesting language that would be an aesthetic design requirement for the fence in lieu of a planting requirement. What would there be? A natural materials requirement?
Better kill their wrought iron fence then.
Yeah, actually, I think the wrought iron would be pretty minimal looking.
Well, I think this prescription, right, of
Yeah,
open,
25%.
open and solid
Yeah,
is a nice generalized way to limit.
So you're willing to give up on the
Yeah.
idea of the planting? It's not that.
well,
Right, because these are not stockade fences
no.
or, so it's not a screening fence. They're going to be 75% open already, so you're seeing through them.
Well, how about if that 10%, that 10-foot minimum of embankment, natural embankment, it needs to be allowed to regenerate or something like that in whatever condition it was in, once the fence has been erected. Like, in other words, you can't have a fence and then, go out there and mow that area or something like that. What we don't want is for somebody to be able to squeak through, and it's another way to, get some unlawful clearing or something like that. And I don't know that wouldn't be able to happen. I mean, the purpose of having the 10-foot setback would be twofold: to secure the bank for erosion purposes, but also to camouflage the fence from passersby on watercraft, right, from the lake. So we maintain that aesthetic goal.
I don't know if I'd be comfortable insisting on that because some fences are gorgeous and the vegetation that grows up ends up being totally scrubby and not like less attractive than it was before because they can't maintain it in any way. I don't know.
Well, it's good for water quality, though, to allow
Right.
vegetation to go back. So,
True.
Grass
you
is
know,
not.
that's the other, I mean, because the lakeshore overlay requirements, you know, that, and ours are very much inspired by the states, are really to have no cut zones and things. So I see where you're going,
Right.
but in our case, there's a water quality
Got it.
bank stabilization goal.
Why would this apply only to lots with a safety fence? Or is this more a general lakeshore overlay issue? That is, if there isn't a fence there, they can do all those things, but now you put a fence up and you have this now buffer zone between the fence and the top, whereas before you could have done anything you wanted consistent with other laws.
But there is a buffer.
Right, so that's not gonna, so to the extent there is already a lakeshore buffer and there are requirements in that regard, that's gonna continue in place regardless of a fence being there. But as far as having special requirements because you put a fence in to deal with that area different than another lot that doesn't have a fence, I think those concerns apply across the board.
Yeah, I think maybe a fairer comparison though, Chris, is the fact that in the allowance for stairs, there are specific requirements regarding the amount of distance of the height of the stairs over the land. So the idea is that someone can put stairs in, but they can't do it a simple, easy way and have one long set of stairs that that is like a suspension bridge that's many feet over some gap. They actually have to hug the land. So there is precedent in the bylaw for the allowance for the structure in the lakeshore setback to follow some kind of specific design requirement. So it isn't as though there's nothing about this discussion that isn't already considered with regard to other structures in the district. It's just, I think, the execution that you might want to use. But, you know, it's trickier perhaps with vegetation if the soil is not going to hold it.
So I guess, I mean, trying to be conscious of time. I mean, we're okay with the height. We think we've got good wording on what kind of qualified hazards we want to protect from. We were okay with the 75-25, and then I think we've got some language we agree on the defining the 4-foot height of this fence. Is there anything?
Well, if someone wanted to make a motion, if
Yeah.
there was that.
But it sounds like do we have a concern that we need to resolve around post-construction maintenance or, you know, lack of, or do we think we've prescribed it with this plus existing lakeshore requirements?
I like the language that Dean was making up on the fly. Can you do that again?
For what?
Regarding topographic hazards,
Yeah,
Yeah, not so I mean, but it sounded like what we were just hashing out was, okay, now we've built the fence.
Right.
What are we
Now,
prescribing after
right.
the fact? And if can we say we're not going to do that and we're good with this?
Do we have to say that constructing a fence does not waive the other conditions of the site? Or do we even need to say that?
I don't think you need to say it. I mean, how would it waive it?
I assume
Well-
that's implied.
If you're trying to run a fence along a straight line and there's 2 trees in the way, do you?
Well, it may be that they can in fact cut 2 trees if they do it within the
With certain
allowance
percentages.
for both the state requirement and the town requirement and complying with the condition. I mean, there are a lot of boxes to check, but it may be. I mean,
Okay. That's just a question.
if you say that the fence can't be constructed at the cost of 2 trees, then you can bet we're gonna have a lot of plans filed to remove 2 trees, and then after that gets approved and the trees are cut,
I wasn't really thinking of 2 trees, but
yeah.
I actually share Dick's concern. I think that the conservation of trees is very critical along the bank shores. So, like ensuring some kind of conservation for, like, they could build the fences but not cut down the trees, or making that kind of condition is critical.
Okay, and if the group wants to go there, then you have to think about how do you prevent gaming? I mean, because the regs don't say that you can't cut any trees. There are restrictions, but you can cut trees. And the only other way that I can think of where you try to address this is in the form-based zoning, where you have the language that says, you have incentives in the form-based zoning proposal. Some of you who were around when we developed it know that you have incentives to protect historic structures, and the whole form-based zoning scheme gives you more development potential, and you opt in, and you have language in there that says that if you demolish a structure and you make an application and you did it outside of form-based zoning, and then you come back in within 5 years to try to get approval under form-based zoning, no dice. So
Could we make it in a form of a recommendation not to remove?
recommendations,
I know.
you just
Worth
said.
the paper they're
You
written
just said earlier tonight.
But this particular, they have their own rules in the association about cutting, correct?
Well, there are conditions. The town doesn't administer the association stuff, so that could be yet another level. But there are conditions of approval regarding cutting, and then there are regulations on cutting that are both, they're town regs and state regs.
It was part of the subdivision approval, had certain conditions regarding trees.
There are what are called forest management zones and view zones, and what you can do in one is different from what you can do in the other, and there's a limit on the number of feet of view zone, and it got kind of complicated.
Well, I feel like the way this was starting to get crafted by when we were cutting out open water and hazards relating to steep embankments and rock faces, that is putting a pretty good limit on where these fences can go. I mean, they really can't be willy-nilly. So I'm feeling pretty confident that this is sufficient. And if there is a steep embankment and/or a rock face, probably somebody's not going to be out there trying to mow it, I mean, they're going to be wanting this to come back.
You should see some of the places I've tried to mow.
So, I think this is pretty sound.
we need
What do
to
you guys think?
Have a final wording that we move to approve.
Ideally,
Yeah.
in the same manner as before.
Okay. Do you want to, do you have a,
I can rattle it off one more time. So 1720.7 would have the permitted use added lakeshore safety fence located at least 10 feet landward from the top of bank. And then, and the definitions, a new definition for the phrase lakeshore safety fence would be added. And that definition would be an artificially constructed open barrier not more than 4 feet in height, erected within the Lakeshore Overlay District to separate people and animals from significant topographic hazards, such as steep embankments or rock faces. A fence shall be considered open if every segment of the fence, e.g. a section between posts, is composed of at least 75% open spaces and no more than 25% solid materials. The height of the fence shall be measured perpendicularly from finished grade at the base of the fence, from the top of the highest horizontal or nearly horizontal element of the fence of any 8-foot section.
That works for me.
Was
Yeah.
that a motion?
yeah,
Can I move the motion to adopt this bylaw, as you read?
Okay, second?
all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Perry?
Aye. Aye.
Okay, thank you, Perry.
And just clarification, you say adopt, it's to get it teed up to move towards adoption. 'Cause-
Yeah.
Yes.
I think that's understood.
All right, well, I thank you very much for your time, and we'll be in touch. I look forward to seeing what comes out the next, and Mr. Halverson thanks you as well.
Great,
Have a
thanks.
good evening.
Thanks for your time. Form-based zoning.
Yes, and in the interest of time, I'm wondering how you would like to proceed. It is the next agenda item,
We have,
but
limited time, and we could do the housing.
I think that would be a good idea. If
Okay.
if you wanted to defer discussion of lakeshore, or form-based zoning, I'm happy to answer any questions that might have been prompted by the material in the packet. And I guess the big question that you might want to ponder is that the two requests that you've heard so far tonight are pretty easy things to tee up and start moving. Now, I didn't include it in the packet, any even the vaguest mention of it, but some of you may remember that for a time, the Planning Commission was working on a list of zoning edits suggested by the DRB. And you had a long list, and let's say there were 10 items on that list, and I think you got through 4 of them or so, and you actually moved them to public hearing, and they got through the hearing, and they got adopted. And then you started working on some others, and you put them on in the hopper, basically, and then other stuff blew up, and we've never gone back to those things that were on the hopper. And I don't remember exactly what they were, but there were 2 or 3, I think at least, topics that you had discussions of, and you had basically said, you know, when we're finally ready to warn a hearing on zoning changes, we'll package all of these together. So generally speaking, it's handy to have edits done in combination rather than to drib and drab. The commission, part of me feels like saying the commission has previously said, a commission has previously said, you know, we'll be ready to warn these for public hearing. There wasn't a motion that I can point to, but if people can accept that, then you would have in your packets, in addition to the 2 tonight, these others. It's really my risk to prepare the bylaw change reports for those things. And if you say, forget about it, then you don't have to go any further. But I just want to remind you that there were some other areas that you had worked on edits at the request of the DRB.
Could you fire those to us tomorrow or
I
something?
can. I
And
can
then
do
we
that.
could come to a consensus if nobody has an issue with something. We could just add it that way.
Well, the chair sets the agenda. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of agenda setting. But yeah, I will send them out, and the conversation will be with Jason. Basically, he'll have to understand what it is that led to this, and if he thinks like, you know, what the worst could happen is that I waste a little bit of time putting together these reports. The best that could happen is everybody goes, oh yeah, this makes sense, and we have things that we can move together as part of the package that we don't have to worry about, or that we don't have the DRB going, hey, whatever happened to that?
Right.
And as contrasted with the form-based zoning, which I don't think it's fair to expect you to be ready to move or even discuss moving to a hearing until you've had some time to chew into it. And unless, and I'm looking at you, Kate, I guess, unless you feel like it's worth trying to sell people on the idea of investing some time while you're working on all the town plan material to get people up to speed on form-based zoning so that they can feel comfortable starting a hearing process.
No, I'm still kind of chewing through it myself. So I think your idea of kind of addressing these other sort of housekeeping things makes some sense. Kind of clear the decks because we have to get back to the town plan
Yes.
stuff too.
Okay.
And
Well,
then-
with that
and
in
then-
mind, then I will fire up so we can look at housing,
Yeah.
and then you can.
And then maybe it would be possible to have a more in-depth, focused conversation about the form-based code stuff for the next time. Is there anything that is waiting in terms of, Brandy's contract, I imagine, is all wrapped up at this point?
It was, the contract ended, and I know that she had billed for slightly more, and she hadn't, Lee was gonna be processing that, but only to the contract amount.
Okay.
We have the document. We don't have she did it in InDesign, and I don't have that InDesign document, but even if I had it, I can't do anything with it because I don't have an InDesign license.
Okay. Okay.
But it's the plan and housing.
see any other comments on the soft copy.
No, there were none that I noticed.
I'm just looking at it here. Okay. Nothing's happened today that I missed. Yeah, so sorry. Dean asked me to sort of take this on the other day because we were switching some other things around. So, I don't know what's the best way to go through this. I mean, basically, I did a little bit of just kind of simple editing in the beginning and then added, you can see this section that's kind of underlined is mainly all new verbiage. Some of it's my own thoughts, some of it trying to incorporate some of the things we've talked about with, protecting the rural area, experimenting with rural hamlets, etc. And then I do have, some other sort of comments and edits as we've gone through the different sections. Some of it because there's some pretty specific and prescribed language that I wasn't 100% sure about whether we needed to keep or go forward. So do you want to go through it like line editing or give you guys a second to read it and digest my edits? Anybody have a preferred method of going through it? Has anybody looked at any of it to this point? Okay. All right. I mean, if we haven't, then
I just didn't get my hands on this until today.
Okay.
I apologize.
yeah, I mean, I can go through. I mean, like I said, we lost Perry. Some simple edits. The objective number 3, the rate of new housing construction should not exceed an average of 45 units per year. I mean, that's existing language, which I assumed we didn't. But again, I defer to some of you guys that have been on it longer than me. That's
just been kind of what
that's sort of a boilerplate language that we would not want to.
it's been floating through history for at least 12 years.
Yeah.
I know some of it's tied obviously towards water, sewer, other schools, other infrastructure pieces.
Sort of historical too. I mean, if you compare the numbers, I think they kind of are close
To reality.
yeah.
Right. So anyway, I left that in place. Similarly with the unit of elder or group housing being 2/5 of a dwelling unit, kind of reeked of a constitutional 3/5 kind of thing. But I thought, this has been thought through and planned out. Similarly with 4 and 5 in terms of the affordable housing and other things, went and looked at that Essex plan that we looked at before, looked at some of the Chittenden County stuff. It all seems pretty consistent with what the larger goals are. Obviously, I think it's really important for Shelburne in particular. We're not a particularly affordable town. The one that you sent us, that Dean had sent us the other day, I was trying to see if I could steal some language out of there in terms of how they prescriptions, and they didn't have anything that I could find right away. And then you can see some comments. So like number 9, this idea of promoting innovative and creative development layouts and construction techniques. I had a note, do we want to call out rural hamlets here, for example, rural hamlets in the rural area, or is that something we want to specifically call out as its own bullet item? And then number 11, I whacked, basically, they explore the creation of incentives that might increase production of housing via the DRB process. Just looking ahead, I didn't see any reason why for the next 5 to 8 years we wanted to increase production of housing if we have Quinny and all these other things already queued up that's going to effectively eat our 45 unit per year growth for the next. So.
And just to explain things a little bit more about the timing, Perry was originally he was scheduled to be talking about the growth and development section first, and he had asked that we switch that with some other section, and housing seemed like a logical topic because he knew he couldn't be here physically tonight, and he felt that it would be better for him to lead the conversation if he could be. The numbers that are in the housing section draw from the rate of growth that's in the growth section. So that, the comment I would make for the group to consider is that in section, or objective 3, where the reference to 45 and 110, those tie to the rate of growth that will be discussed in the growth section. Just by way of quick reminder, though, the growth projections for the coming decades are pretty modest relative to what they have been in the past. So those
Right.
numbers would go down, and they're going to be very, very quickly, mindful of the time. There are a couple of things that are going in opposite directions that the group is going to have to address. We have projections that are telling us that the rate of growth in Shelburne and other towns is going to be pretty modest. We have a requirement in the law for the housing section that says we are supposed to have policies that address the need for affordable housing that's based on a regional projection. Right now, there's no regional projection, but just to put it into context, the regional projection from a decade ago was looking at something like 10,000 units over 10 years in all of the county. That worked out to Shelburne's share was 535. So this idea of 53 affordable units was 10% of our, that was our annual growth, I should say.
Yeah.
So it was 53 units per year. That's going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 110 persons. We don't have comparable projections or housing needs assessment, but they're likely to be higher. So what the conflict you're going to have to address is that the forecasted housing need is going to be greater than the numbers suggest, the forecasted growth suggests, and you're going to have to reconcile that. It's like, what are we doing if we aren't growing very fast? Why do we need this much housing? And the short answer is, as Regina Mahoney at the Regional Planning Commission confirmed in an email to me, is that, well, just generally speaking, household sizes are getting smaller, and even though the rate of population growth is slowing, the housing rate is not slowing as much. Just wanted to mention that because we're going to talk about these numbers again, and you're going to have to make them
So
make
that
sense.
suggests to me that we should be thinking about, accessory dwelling units and converting how, large single-family houses could be converted into two-family houses and things like that.
What about
Yeah.
To adapt.
apartments in Route 7 corridor? I mean, a lot of younger people are looking forward to apartments now and not using cars. So
Right.
maybe this is our time to focus on that in that section of town. And
Right, so, but also adapting our existing housing stock for, to be more flexible uses.
Yeah, the thing about accessory apartments is that state law protects them. Our regulations acknowledge that. So if someone has a single-family house that they live in, they can have an accessory apartment. There's really no obstacle to that. It's just that not everybody wants an accessory apartment in their house. So if we want to try to increase our housing stock by promoting accessory apartments, then we'd have to ask ourselves, well, just exactly how are we going to do that?
Well, through, not necessarily as, within a house, but also in the rural areas, for example, I would think in a separate structure would make quite a bit of sense.
Shelburne's, just to clarify, Shelburne's not like some towns that say your accessory apartment only can be in the house. In Shelburne, we interpret appurtenant to, that's the statutory requirement, as saying it can be in the barn out back. So we don't restrict that.
they still have to deal with stormwater, so there is some constraint. Adding a bedroom.
Stormwater?
No, I mean, not stormwater, sewer,
Septic.
wastewater.
Yeah, well, that
It's
limits
stormwater in the
everything,
brain.
yeah.
That's not our bailiwick anymore, though.
Yeah, I mean, I looked the that Essex plan, which was cool, was a lot more distilled than ours. Like, so again, I looked at other ways to get rid of a bunch of this stuff, and kind of like starting fresh. But so much of the stuff seemed to had a historical legacy as to why it was there, and it was tied, that I was afraid to get rid of some of this stuff. So that's why I was,
Yeah, and I guess that could be an important question for the group to address, and that is, do you feel the need to have some of this language that has to do with essentially making sure that Shelburne doesn't grow too fast? Is that, if the projections are very modest to begin with, do you need a lot of language in there that is to ensure that the town not grow too fast if there's really not much indication that the town would grow fast?
I don't think it hurts to have that in there. I don't think it's not being a negative at any point, and when it does, then I think that's the time to change it.
Yeah.
Not to just delete it because it's,
I hear you. I'm just bringing it up because one of the conversations early on was trying to make the document shorter, more readable.
yeah, yeah.
So you'd gotten down to recommended actions, right?
Yeah,
number 4, maybe it should be support instead of encourage.
number
Just an
4.
offer, on the mobile home park.
Oh, the mobile home, yeah, so that was a question too, was,
We
The-
don't have to do anything as far as that goes, because usually that works through some state agency or a funding group.
well, I guess, I know the big one here around, I guess that way behind the Bearded Frog,
Yeah.
that they did that. How many other, ones are out there that would be I mean, I guess I didn't know, is this something that we even need to note this? Or can we just strike this?
Well, I think a little bit of context for that is that Vermont law is such that if someone who operates a mobile home park wants to sell it, the law says the residents have to have a first chance to try to buy it.
Right,
And that's where this comes from, that someone can't decide that they're gonna change the mobile home park.
kick everybody out and develop it.
Well, the way around it is someone can decide to close a park.
Right,
And so the thing that people can sometimes do is to say, well, I'm not gonna sell it, I'm gonna close it. But then that generally gets a response from the residents and communities, and they look for ways to try to exercise this, this option to have the residents become the owners. And what we've had happen here more recently is that it goes co-op. And Tony Pomerla did help in that. The other 2 mobile home parks are owned by very different ownerships. Lake Champlain Transportation Company owns the mobile home park that's it's off of Route 7, up near the South Burlington line.
Right.
They've owned that for many, many years. Ray Pecor is Lake Champlain Transportation, also invested in many other real estate projects.
that's the one that sort of slopes down towards the lake, yeah. And then what about the one,
And then there's the
Nashville.
Rooney Park, so-called, which is off of Spear Street.
right, by Bishop Road?
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's nothing that I've heard that suggests that either one of those owners are thinking of selling. The parks are somewhat different in terms of their character. The town has not been the party that's been playing the key role in these kinds of conversations. There's the OEO, the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity, has a wing that deals specifically with mobile home parks to try to help residents take these things over. I mean, I think the general idea is still solid because people think that it's important for the residents. But when things are just kind of static, I don't know that people feel the pressure to actively seek.
Got it.
resident-
okay, I'm fine keeping it and changing it to support,
Yeah, I was just thinking
right,
we don't need to encourage it. There's only 2.
yeah.
If it comes about, it'll happen. I was wondering on number 7, just down. That doesn't seem very effective. And
Density bonuses don't seem effective?
It's not effective. We take the Schneider project, there's no recommendation for affordable housing of any type in that project, is there?
We don't have any density bonuses there.
Okay. Where we do have them, has it been,
Well, The
Other
density
than-
bonuses, if I'm remembering it correctly, are pretty much limited to the village center district.
Okay.
And when the Harrington Village project was being planned, you may remember they had an initial project design that did rely on density bonus, but then they ran into that problem of the geotechnical analysis showed that we have the situation with sand over clay and it's unstable. So they had to scale back their design, and they ended up not really having room for enough units that would have justified a density bonus.
Maybe we need to look at a way of, in larger developments, to encourage or to require some sort of affordable housing mix to be included, even if it's minimal. When you have 100 units being built, you should expect a few to be affordable.
So something around X units and above, we'd have to define X there, like all developments greater than
Or
some
maybe
number.
a percentage of.
So regardless of size.
2 or 3% or something, so it wouldn't really be effective.
Right.
Maybe a fee, if you're building a 5-unit and you don't have enough to build a unit, you kick in a half a unit somewhere.
Right.
I'm just trying to think of some way we could,
So inclusionary zoning basically is what you're looking at?
yeah, some form. I know, I don't want to make it too restrictive because it is a big turnoff for a developer. But typically they can work with Champlain Housing and,
So, I mean,
to put a couple of duplexes or something in the Schneider project that were affordable. And do we allow elderly density up there, a bonus?
I guess I'm trying to get a handle, Dick, on what you're saying is, should the plan say something about inclusionary zoning? Because it does, it wants it. And are you talking about taking the next step? When the plan's done, you'd like to see effort made to actually change the zoning so that there's an inclusionary requirement.
Well, we've talked about it before. I'm just, just reading that prompted me to think that we really don't have any, we don't have a hammer to do that at this point in time.
Right, but the
And it
plan
is
provides
supposedly
you
a-
a place to say, hey, let's look at doing this in our zoning. But it's not like you're feeling like this language is inadequate to support that, because.
This is a reminder of what I'm expressing.
I mean, it's not like you have a problem with the,
I don't have a problem with
In-
number 7 as it's written, no,
okay.
no. What,
And
the
this is
issue,
not our last chance to hack at this, so that when we learn more about growth and
Right.
demographics, that may be a chance to come back and tinker more with this.
yeah, it's just been a town goal
Yeah.
for a long time, and
No, I'd love
And
to
we-
see a stronger word than
And
consider, yeah.
we were able to sit back because we did have a couple of really large projects. So.
I have a comment about the hamlets, integration of hamlets in this. I think there are a lot of recommendations where some of the hamlet concept, form-based concept, can intervene with some of these recommendations. Especially the hamlets, the way those are written later, in terms of, like they can influence how do you design or promote housing of different densities, depending on their access to transportation and other kinds of amenities.
Right.
'Cause I would actually prefer to provide opportunities to have places that have a mix of housing rather than force a developer to include and have inclusionary zoning, and then, those people are sort of ghettoized within that development, A hamlet has the opportunity to be a kind of more organic extension of the existing housing that is here, that would and if you look at our village, it's a natural mix of housing, the historic structures. There's some very large houses, there's some smaller houses. Again, there could be accessory buildings like garages or something that could have an apartment above. I mean, you could have a lot more flexible
compilations of structures together, so that we're not all in these little ghettoized pods.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
my point was
yeah.
that as opposed to having a separate section on hamlets, like integrating those in this language that Andrew just kind of like updated in the recommendations, that might be better, more organic, as opposed to having a separate section, and you could have like, the priorities might look different with two different sections.
Yeah, I mean,
If
the
you
other,
integrate them better, those would reflect the kind of the vision you want to have.
the other issue we have is, I mean, we have to do this piecemeal, like each taking chunks and pieces, but it's sort of
Yeah.
like, as was trying to work on this, I'm always thinking in my head, like, all right, well, Kate's already talked about the rural area and, all this sort of different things, and make sure that, some of the things we've emphasized in one section aren't neglected here, if there's logical ways
Yeah.
to tie it in. So that was just my thought on the Hamlet piece and trying to think of other things we've talked about. I mean, housing's so all-encompassing a term, too. So that's again where I was trying to think of how do I distill this down to say, okay, what are the 5 things we want out of housing in this town? But again, so many of these things that were in here already, I'm like, that doesn't seem like a terrible thing, and that seems to make sense. It's logical. Yes, we'd still want that, but so my thought was more like, could we cut a lot of the stuff that's in here that seems to be kind of just historical stuff that it's not that we disagree with it, but
You can make broader statements.
yeah, what are the 5 things we're looking for in housing?
I think we could, and I think we could talk about it, as Asim is suggesting, kind of more formally, more in terms of the form that we're after, and then these things like affordability and stuff like that become, they get organized under those rubrics. So
Right.
so right now we're there's no hierarchy, and it's very cumbersome to understand and read
Yeah.
and everything. So I think, just looking at what you were saying here, I mean, I think you set it up kind of nicely just in this opening statement. The challenge will include maintaining, you say a good mix. I'm kind of thinking maybe we should take out good, just because who knows what that means. A mix
Sure.
of rental and ownership properties. New development shall be targeted towards our growth areas where it can be close to employment, shopping, schools, and public transportation. Not all growth will be limited to our growth areas, so another challenge will be to keep the rural area true to its nature and designation, which I think is a very great way of stating that. And then it's important that Shelburne experiment and maybe pursue, hamlets and other means to keep any increase in rural housing from impacting forests, view sheds, wildlife corridors, and water quality. So I think you've sort of created a picture of, that it's a vision, of where we're talking about,
Right.
that I think it very effectively summarizes many of the discussions that we've had, and that, maybe we can get into, maybe the objectives can be more geared towards that than,
That's exactly what I was trying to say.
Yeah.
Was like, so that's like the opening paragraph looks pretty good, where you have added the text about hamlets and that vision, and also the smart growth areas. But then in the objectives, then it doesn't come back as kind of like an overarching vision. So
Right.
like, it's just still addressing some important issues.
like I
but-
said, most of these, so 1 through whatever,
Yeah.
11, are basically, it's all legacy stuff.
Yeah, so something
Yeah.
there, like adding about language about hamlets, integrating that as some of the key objectives.
like, for example, 6, I don't think you really even need to have 6 in there, because you've kind of stated it wonderfully in that opening paragraph. So maybe we can just kind of turn this on its head and go straight to recommended actions, or, I don't know.
You're talking about affordable workplace housing? Is that number
Yeah,
6?
just because that's addressed in the, personally, I would like to get away from this idea that affordable housing has to be, people who have to live in affordable housing have to live, in these under these certain conditions. I would really like to see them, kind of more mixed in with everybody else, not singled out, so.
Well, I mean, that's what I was trying to get with
Yeah,
number 4 and 5
yeah.
above, right? I mean, it's pretty prescribed, like we shall have 10% of new housing being affordable. Do we need to be that particular of 10% need to be in this and then 10% in this other percentage? Or do we want to just make a general preference towards,
Well, the regional guidelines a decade ago were 10 and 10.
Yeah.
And that's what we followed through on, but there are no longer such regional guidelines in place, so it'd really be better for it to read with something like consistent with past plans. That's
Right.
well, if you want to go in that direction.
right,
The thing I was going to just flash on the screen is that the key reason why a lot of this language is in here is the statutory requirement for the plan, which says that, what does the housing element include? It's the recommended program for addressing low and moderate income persons' housing needs. So your plan spells out through policies how Shelburne wants to address the needs for low and moderate income persons. I totally understand where you might want, or you might feel that it doesn't, it's no longer necessary for the plan to say that affordable and workforce housing in particular should be located in blah, 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 close to public services. But if you take it out, you might want to think about, because what I think I heard Kate said is that her vision is that affordable and workforce housing would be mixed in with all the others. Well, you might want to make that statement, because that's a change. It's not going to be necessarily not necessarily everyone will agree. There are certainly people that I've encountered in my career who think that affordable housing should be, separate. It should be different. I'm not saying that I agree with that, but if we're saying in Shelburne that we don't want it to be separate, I think it's good to say that.
yep,
I'd agree with saying that. I think that is a case, right? You don't want to create ghettos. And it probably shouldn't even have to say that.
so, and then I get,
People should live in a community, not be segregated.
I mean, there's sort of this narrative in the beginning, and then objectives and recommended actions. I mean, the narrative's the most easily readable pieces of it because it's actually written sort of for layperson. I mean, like sometimes the objectives are very granular. So, I mean, I guess I'm looking for, because I agree with that, but should be added into this narrative overview and then referenced as an objective and recommended action later. I mean, it's just some of it sometimes is redundant, right? So, again, I was looking at the Essex one and they've kind of, it's pretty short and discreet, like just what are the top 5 things we want to do?
3, 4, 5.
And there's
It's
less of
bizarre.
the narrative, but I don't know. So I guess that would be my question back to you guys is it's easy for me to write something articulating that in this narrative section up front, but I may be adding another objective and recommended action, and now my lists have gotten longer rather than shorter. So maybe if you guys want to look at this,
Might be easy to combine some of those
right?
recommended actions because they do say a lot of the same.
I mean, in terms of
The same
feedback,
goal.
well, and feedback from you guys to me, I would be interested in, as you guys have more time to look at it, like especially what doesn't need to be in there. What objectives have we met, are less important, or can be consolidated.
And maybe a different approach is going to help people be freer with their ideas. If it's better to just have 15 minutes at the start of every session where everybody puts the previously written material aside and you just have a conversation about, well, what are the 3 things that you think are most important regarding providing housing for low and moderate income people in Shelburne for the next 50 years. Just don't get hung up on all the previous language. At least if you can identify those areas, it'll make zeroing in on them easier.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Dick has mentioned inclusionary zoning. If there's a consensus, maybe that becomes a focal point. Not always, it's a little more risky because it's kind of a contentious topic.
Right. Well, I mean,
If you do it in a fashion where you have 10 units being built, and one is elderly, and one might be affordable. And on a, on a percentage basis, you don't have to call it inclusionary, but it's, if a development has 10 houses, it will have an elderly unit.
How do you define an elderly unit within a 10-house development? Well, I guess when I think of the elderly,
55 and over, 60, I don't know.
Yeah, 55 and older is the.
but I mean, how's that structure any different than, say, the same house that a young couple could buy?
It's smaller, it's designed, and it's an elder unit, so when it's sold, it's continued to be sold as an elder unit.
Okay. So wider doors for
Yeah,
wheelchairs and not second floors and so things that are,
and a lot of development requires some of that anyway, even in generic housing.
right.
Well, it sounds like, you.
I'm happy to take another pass
Yeah,
through it,
yeah, and-
but if you guys, yeah.
And you know what statute requires has to be in this thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say just go for it, just,
Yeah.
put
Yeah.
something together, because what you have is, like 1,000 times more appealing than what was
Yeah.
there, and I would be hugely in favor of, some of this, I don't even know what it means, really. It's just-
Well, that's
Those
just,
things could be blended. They seem to say the same thing.
yeah. If you guys can just send me, 2 to 3 things you think
Okay,
are critical for the housing section, then that'll help me probably think of, I can easily turn that into 5 objectives and 5 recommended actions, that we all agree on. And then we would just circle back to that whenever housing comes up again. For round 2. I mean, looking at your chart,
Yeah, that's, the one that was included, I'm trying to remember if it was the one that did in fact switch these 2 topics.
well, this is the second meeting in January, which we are talking about it, and then it should come up again the second meeting in February.
and
Yeah.
along with transportation, which I've been working on.
Yep.
So, and just on a note, Andrew, like what you said earlier on, like in the objectives number 3, 4, and 5, to me they look like really trying to state the same point, but very redundant. And maybe those could be kind of like combined into one. It's about
Yeah.
this balancing this 10%, and I think it's just like, but it seems to me that those 3 could be combined, and then some of these later
Objective 3, 4,
ones.
5, you said.
Yeah, 3, 4, 5 could be.
So Dean, towers and telecommunication, do we have somebody assigned to that? Wasn't Jamie gonna do that?
We haven't,
I suppose he still can.
that had not been resolved, if I'm remembering correctly.
Oh, okay. All right.
And we still need natural resources. And the thing I will say about natural resources, as far as a lead and the amount of work that person will do, the Natural Resources Committee has done a lot of work. So this is a pretty significantly redlined document. So that one, the commission may feel the need to have a liaison, or maybe not.
So what's unassigned at this point?
Natural
Natural-
resources, telecom, and since you've picked up housing is covered. I think those were the 3. And I had assumed that citizen participation, that piece is something that kind of gets put together. It doesn't get written in the same way that the others do. Flood resiliency is something that's one of the new requirements, and our recommendation in the past has been that be folded into natural resources.
And the historic cultural resources, is that,
That was your.
that's a section I've already presented?
It was, but it was going to be coming back in March.
Right,
Kind of
okay.
like the polish.
But again, March and April, if I'm reading
Well,
that
the
right.
idea was that, yes, if I'm remembering that correctly, for whatever reason, we had a check-in with land use, historic and cultural, natural, and then
A final
a
pass.
final for that in late April, but the land use and natural resources, we're gonna need a bit more time.
Got it.
I guess I can do the natural resources if we need somebody.
If
For that.
if you're prepared, then I can, Susan Megenberg is working on that a lot with Gail, and
Okay,
they have a document that's pretty far along.
okay.
Do we know if Jamie has done anything on towers and telecom already?
He had not done anything, but
Okay.
the sense was that it's a relatively new section of the plan, and it probably isn't going to need a lot of work.
I can
Right.
take a look at that.
And it's pretty short, pretty small section too, right?
Sounds just right.
Okay.
So is there anything else that doesn't have an owner at this point?
I don't believe
Okay.
it with my other comments. If people can bear, I'm not sure how quickly people want to bolt, but as far as the other business, I did want to draw attention to the things that were included in the meeting packet that came from the housing subcommittee. So if you're ready to go to that, or you want to in a moment or so.
Yes.
So included in the meeting packet was a paragraph-long email from Ron Bouchard, the chair. The process that was worked up as far as hamlets was, it had the housing subcommittee getting together, coming up with a list of essentially criteria or helping define what a hamlet is, and that they would generate material, share it with the planning commission so that you could react to it. Basically say, hey, you're on the right track, or no, you're on the wrong track, before they went the next step, which was to identify areas in town that might be evaluated as hamlets using these criteria. So in your packets is kind of a mishmash of stuff, but the very first page that has the header hamlets that looks like I'll show on the board, shows that they see as criteria for, or what defines a hamlet, as these paragraphs. And the ones that have asterisks are the first 1, 2, 3, 4. Common institutional or commercial focal point, continuity, the location at a public road or intersection, walkability. Those are the top things that they associate with identifying hamlets. And then, as they see it, edges, work-live arrangement. Anyway, you've seen this, you can read it. Carries over to the next page. So this is kind of a rough working list of.
And did that list, just so I'm clear what they sent, come as the aggregation of these
Yeah.
additional notes? So everybody worked on the things that they thought were important, and we see member number 1 here, member number 2, member 3, and those.
I mean, some of this, I think they didn't all share the information in the meeting, but I think they had it. And Ron wanted people to, I think, understand the different perspectives.
Right, but can we read this first page as the consolidation of?
That's how I read it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think they're off to a wonderful start. I think this is terrific.
And if the sense of the commission is that, yes, this doesn't need any adjustment, so go ahead and work with this list of criteria, and you may say to them, identify 3 possible hamlet sites. Or you may not care about how many they generate. You may care though. And if you do care, you could tell them, do at least 3 or do at least 5.
I'd say do as many as you're comfortable with.
Many as they're comfortable with.
As many as they feel like they can attack. I mean, what is their? They're
If they were only
they're
comfortable
looking at
doing
sites.
one,
If
would
they
you be happy? I mean,
if they find 3 sites or five sites, it gives. If you find 5, then odds are one of them will work, or 2 maybe. But, so just doing 3, maybe we don't. Maybe we don't want to limit them to less than what they might want to do.
Yeah, I don't, yeah. So whatever it is that this commission wants them to do, Ron wants it to be clear and specific. And if this group's view is it's good and do anything you want, then I'll take that down verbatim and I'll say, Ron, this is what they said. But if you can be more specific, because you want to be more specific, I'd say, do it, and I'll tell him. But he doesn't like flashing yellow lights. He wants red or green. And so, I mean, hearing Kate say it's a good start, and if that means go ahead and just exercise your own judgment, then that's what I'll tell him.
Well, I'd like to know, we started this with the idea of maybe doing something in the rural area, and I'm wondering if they feel that there's a place out there for this to work, or are they thinking more closer to the village?
I think that they may be thinking that I don't want to put words in their mouths, but I think that there are some of them whose experience leads them to believe that this idea of creating a hamlet, it's going to be really hard. And that what might be more likely, not necessarily more desirable, but might be more likely is expansions to the village. And maybe in a hamlet form, but so, that does pull us into the village and possibly on the edges or maybe even outside of the rural area. So if this
Well,
group
I
wanted to
think we
tell them,
should think a little bit creatively. I mean, we've been talking about this as something for the rural area, but this could also be a wonderful approach to use for suggesting ways for how growth could proceed within the growth area too. We have a lot of undeveloped land within our growth area. And are there places where maybe some of this could then sort of spill over into the rural area, places that are like on that boundary? Could this be something that they could use,
well, that's where I think
apply
if you
sort
said,
of flexibly?
I think that's where if you said something like, hey, evaluate at least 3 sites in the rural district, and if you feel like it, do 2 more inside the growth area.
Yeah.
I mean, they might jump at that.
I think that sounds like a good suggestion
Or
right
find-
there.
Find 1 or 2 in the rural area, if that's what's there. I just feel like the soils out there aren't gonna warrant what we're defining as a hamlet. But, and
Could
also,
we- could-
also the walkability, I mean, if they're not gonna walk from Dorset Street to the village,
No, but I think the
No.
hamlet itself has to be walkable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But I guess
So-
the question would be, I mean, could we just say, regardless of whether it's rural or not, but with a preference towards finding rural locations, could they identify, 3 to 5 spots in Shelburne that would work towards hamlet development?
Yeah, sounds good.
So is this all driven towards additional housing units, or might they also consider current housing units and creating more of a hamlet-like feel rather than just residential,
We might-
but create like a little center to a current?
It's all of those things. It's sort of, the question, Susanna, we were trying to ask is how do we accommodate future growth in a way that as much as possible preserves the existing character of Shelburne and doesn't turn us into South Burlington?
Right.
Because we're going to be facing some, I mean, Quinniesca is a great example of some of the development pressure that's
Right.
coming our way. So, the default is the Quinniesca project. That's like what happens if you
Or 5-acre McMansions in some
yeah,
rural
yeah.
chunk
So
of land.
so how could we be a little bit more proactive and
Put a deli in there.
yeah, and kind of come up with ways that we think would be, kind of cool ways to accommodate this, and what would that look like, and how do you do that, and what does that look like in Shelburne especially? And so it seems to make a lot of sense to many of us that having Shelburne residents pose and answer those questions was the best way to sort of start to get at some of this. So now we're trying to figure out, okay, I think they came up with a fabulous, description of what, would be nice to have that I think would resonate with most people. Now the question is, okay, well, where? And, again, just the default is conventional subdivisions, so I don't see, I think let's see how this could play out in the rural area, but also why limit it to the rural area? We have, most of the growth areas or considerable parts of the growth areas are undeveloped at this point. And we also have learned in the last year or so that we have, they're maybe a bit more fragile than we had understood previously because of riparian corridors and habitat and all sorts of stuff. So I think that argues in favor of pursuing more compact, walkable development, and then having more open space around them that can maybe remain open, rather than the conventional approach which would be, larger single-family lots, more sort of sprawl, car-dependent subdivisions.
Right.
We might encourage development rights from the rural area to come closer to the
Yeah.
core.
Yeah, so we're just really experimenting with a lot of different ideas now, like.
But you could see where, like, where I live on Webster Road, right, you could have that, well, I guess the one got turned into art studio, and then you've
Right,
got
it's a
the,
perfect example.
and you've got the, nursery there. We always joke about the nursery just needs to add a coffee shop and
Yeah.
a beer thing,
Right.
like,
Right, so enhancing current development.
yeah, I mean, you could have a little Webster Road hamlet theoretically, like something that
Yeah.
could,
Right, I mean, so
create
that's what I was going,
walkable
that's where I
things
was
for the
going with,
kids.
just to enhance current development as well
Yeah.
as look at new.
Yeah.
So, just to maybe help wrap this up,
Yeah.
if it sounds like it would be okay for me to say something like, good job so far, carry on. Instructions are to identify 3 to 5 spots in Shelburne for evaluation and evaluate them. Preferences for locations in the rural area, but it's not restricted to the rural area. Is that right? Is that what you basically said?
It does sound, kind of echoes what I
Sounds
said.
ambitious.
I don't know if everybody else agrees with it.
Yeah.
Can we also share this housing section with them?
Yeah, it's funny because, did I send you the notice for the workshop on housing that's Monday night? They're all going, so I'm gonna be seeing them Monday.
Okay.
I've mentioned this idea, some of it's gonna be timing and bandwidth, but if we say to them, if you have time, take a look at it. Ron really wants to get into the Hamlet stuff, but if he feels like they can do both, I would encourage it.
Yeah.
It's also something that you might want to give some thought to reaching out to people in some of the housing nonprofits. Might be able to suggest 1 or 2 names if you want to go in that direction. I
Yeah.
haven't done it for other sections, but it's one where maybe. And some of the people who are at this workshop on Monday are the kind of people we could approach.
Okay. What is the workshop and where?
It's something that's sponsored by the Regional Planning Commission, and I'm pretty sure I sent out, I forwarded an email back in mid-December where it was sort of save the date,
Right.
and it's at, it's a hotel on Williston Road that used to be.
So it's this coming Monday, the 29th.
This Monday night, the
Yeah.
29th. 6
Okay.
to 8, something like that.
Yeah, I have a board meeting that I have to be in, but
There will be, I think, 5 of us there.
okay.
So it's going to be a pretty big Shelburne.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking in terms of like, I kind of came at that section relatively ignorant and would love those guys have been thinking about it, working on it. I would love their
Yeah.
thoughts on that. So,
I think people like Ron and Mark Brooks would probably be willing to throw some time. When I see Mark,
yeah,
if I don't see him before Monday.
okay. That'd be great. I mean, smart enough to know what I don't know and would love their help.
Well, I will let them know. Ron.
Any other business correspondence? Or can we,
I think a
I
motion
will
to
entertain a
adjourn.
motion to adjourn otherwise.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thanks.
All right, we're.